Hello, everyone, and welcome to History's Dark Chronicles New Year's Marathon. This is Alan G., your host. I hope you had a pleasant Christmas, and I'd like to wish everyone a Happy New Year. And those of you who gave me their birthday wishes on the 28th, thank you very, very much. May the new year be very prosperous for you, as I hope it will be for me and my family. There will be new episodes coming up in the new year. So say hello to 2026 with this History's Dark Chronicles Marathon.
Two New York State troopers on a typical patrol noticed that the vehicle they observed did not have a license plate. What they believed would be an uneventful evening turned into the discovery of one of the most heinous crimes in New York in American crime history. The driver of the unlicensed vehicle executed his most aberrant fantasies in the wholesale murder of sex workers in and around the New York area. Although the troopers were aware of the crimes and that a serial killer may be on the loose in their region, they never dreamed that a routine traffic stop would signal the end of the killer's reign of terror.
At approximately 3:15 a.m. on the morning of June 28, 1993, two New York State troopers, Deborah Spargerin and Sean Ruane, worked the graveyard shift in East Meadow, Long Island. The two troopers spotted a pickup truck that did not have a license plate moving at a moderate rate of speed just ahead of their cruiser. The driver was not speeding, and the lack of a license plate was only a minor offense, but because of a slow night, their flashers went on. The driver did not stop, but he did not speed away from the pursuing officers either. Troopers Spargerin and Ruane turned on the siren, and the driver seemed to ignore the sound and kept driving. The troopers called for backup as the driver refused to stop. After 10 minutes and a rather medium-speed chase, the driver appeared to miss a turn and crashed into a lamppost at the Mineola intersection. As the driver exited the vehicle, he faced several troopers with their weapons drawn. The driver then handed over his driver's license. Troopers Spargerin and Ruane detected a smell coming from the bed of the truck. The two lawpersons noticed something long and wrapped in a large plastic bag with some rope to contain the contents. The officers became very hesitant to view what was in the package, but duty compelled them to do so. What they found was a tarp with the decomposing body of a young woman. The driver helped the authorities identify the body as that of 22-year-old Tiffany Bresciani, a prostitute, according to the driver whom he had sex with and then killed her. The driver elaborated that the police officer stopped him as he was on his way to Republic Airport in order to dump the body. What the authorities later realized was that the man they caught while trying to elude police was responsible for the deaths of approximately 17 victims and remained undetected for more than 5 years. Known as the Long Island serial killer, this individual became one of the most prolific killers in American crime history and cemented his legacy within the annals of criminal behavior. The man arrested at the site where he lazily tried to avoid the police, crashing his vehicle, was born on January 20th, 1959, and adopted 3 weeks later by Ben and Jean Rifkin, who they later named their son Joel Rifkin. Ben Rifkin earned a living as a structural engineer, and his wife, Jean, was a homemaker. The family lived in the small village of Clarkstown, New York. When Joel reached the age of 3, Ben and Jean adopted their second child, a girl they named Jan. The family moved around within a short radius until they finally settled in East Meadow, Long Island, New York. The Rifkins soon became involved in local politics with their school board, and Ben received a spot on the board of trustees with the East Meadow Public Library. Joel Rifkin grew up as a smart child, yet he was extremely shy and experienced a hard time making friends. The young Rifkin felt as though he may have been a disappointment to his father, who exhibited exceptional intelligence and became involved in the local school board. Even though Joel was tested and received an IQ of 128, he struggled in school as a young child. What the Rifkins became unaware was that Joel had undiagnosed dyslexia. Growing into an awkward teenager, Joel did not make friends very easily. constantly teased because of his hunched posture and glasses, Joel Rifkin felt extremely uncomfortable within his own body. As he entered high school, the teasing got worse and he earned the nickname of Turtle due to his appearance. Bullying followed where the athletes made fun of the nerdy young man. Rifkin became more withdrawn and never confronted his bullies. Instead, he retreated to the safety of his bedroom more and more. As a result of his isolation, those who called themselves Joel's friends only drew him out of the house to perform mean pranks on the teenager, throwing eggs at him, pulling his pants down in front of girls, or, and this seemed to be the ultimate insult, shoving his head in a toilet. Rifkin further withdrew into his room, where he imagined the most evil and sordid violent sex fantasies. Whether he fantasized as a form of revenge or whether they truly gave him solace is beyond speculation. In one instance, Joel's parents gave him a new camera as a gift. He joined his high school's yearbook staff as a photographer, and his assignments included capturing moments of the seniors throughout the year. Joel hoped that this would be a way for him to meet girls, and perhaps his classmates would become more ingratiated toward him. That dream fell apart when someone stole the camera the first day he brought it to school in order to execute his assignments. Even though he was a photographer without a camera, Joel stayed with the yearbook anyway, taking his assignments seriously. When that year's edition finished, the staff had a wrap-up party, but they did not invite Joel, even though he had a great deal to do with the yearbook's timely production. Joel Rifkin reeled from the humiliation and the devastation of not being included with the yearbook staff. He once again retreated to the haven of his bedroom and read more stories regarding serial killers. Joel found the Hitchcock movie Frenzy to be very sexually stimulating, most especially when women were being strangled within the film. Because of his isolation, Rifkin's fantasies became intensified with themes of sexual assault, sadism, and murder. These fantasies amplified as Rifkin read more books and saw more movies with the aforementioned themes. After graduating from high school, Rifkin registered for classes at Nassau County Community College and commuted using a car his parents purchased for him. Rifkin reasoned that because he did not live directly off campus or in student housing, he became even more of an outsider. Although he looked forward to the collegiate environment as a way to gain friends and enjoy the college atmosphere, he became gravely disappointed and even became more isolated than before. Because of his antisocial behavior, Rifkin then decided to cruise for prostitutes on the city streets near his home. He found it more comfortable to pay for sex than to actually socialize within his minuscule circle. From that point forward, Rifkin concentrated only on sex with prostitutes and implementing the masochistic fantasies he dreamed about for years in isolation. Rifkin soon missed classes, missed work, and cost him a lot of money in pursuit of his addiction. He exhibited a slight confidence and self-esteem as Rifkin found women that seemed to want to be around him, as long as he had money in his pocket. Because of the time he spent with prostitutes, Rifkin dropped out of Nassau Community College, enrolled at another college, and saw himself drop out of that institution as well. It also seemed that the home that he occupied with his parents had a revolving door as Rifkin moved out, then moved in, then moved out again, a cycle that seemed never-ending. In 1986, Joel Rifkin suffered a devastating loss when his father, Ben Rifkin, committed suicide after having been diagnosed with cancer the year before. At the funeral, Rifkin honored his father with a heartfelt eulogy describing all the love that his father had given him throughout his life. In actuality, Rifkin considered himself to be a failure in his father's eyes. But his father's demise did spell one advantage for the young Rifkin. He could pursue his dark side without a perceived judgment from his father. After leaving college again in early 1989, after failing all of his courses, Rifkin pursued his secret life with that of engaging prostitutes. His fantasies regarding murder could no longer be contained by this time. In March of that year, Rifkin's mother and sister left to go on vacation, at which time he drove to New York City and picked up a prostitute, bringing her back to the family home. When the two arrived at the house, the prostitute shot up heroin, slept, and took more drugs. This behavior angered Rifkin, who took a World War II artillery shell and beat the young girl about the head and then strangled her until she expired. Rifkin's actions did not seem to bother him at that point, as he went to sleep after murdering the girl. When Rifkin awoke 6 hours later, he went back to determining what to do with the victim's body. First, he extracted the corpse's teeth, then scraped away her fingerprints. He used an X-Acto knife to divide the body into 6 parts that he scattered between New York, Long Island, and New Jersey. Her head was later discovered on a New Jersey golf course, and at the time, she could not be identified. Later, through a DNA match, the young girl was identified as Heidi Balch, a local prostitute. With the head discovered inside of an empty paint can, Rifkin panicked, but then he remembered when he dismembered the body, he did remove the teeth. But then he promised himself that he would never kill again. It was just a one-time thing. History would prove Rifkin's pledge false. Rifkin's promise to himself lasted approximately 16 months when he took advantage of his sister and mother leaving town again. He went out that night after they left and picked up another prostitute, Julie Blackbird, and brought her back to the house. After the transaction of their business, Rifkin went to an ATM to withdraw money and discovered he had a zero balance. When he returned to the residence, Rifkin beat Blackbird to death with a table leg, finished her through strangulation, and dismembered the body in his basement. He then placed the various parts in buckets of cement, waited for them to dry, and dumped them at locations in and around the East River and the Brooklyn Canal. Blackbird's remains were never discovered. After the murder and dismemberment of Blackbird's corpse, Rifkin did not make a promise not to kill, but decided that dismemberment was a rather unpleasant business and would not perform that function again. Meanwhile, in order to gain some more money, Rifkin went into lawn care. At one time, he attempted to launch a lawn care business and rented a storage unit to keep his equipment. The storage unit also served another purpose. Future bodies would be stored there. Starting in 1991, after his lawn care business went bankrupt, Rifkin went into massive debt and worked a few part-time jobs. But the part-time work interfered with his most enjoyable pastime, murdering prostitutes. Rifkin also believed that when he continued to murder, he would not be apprehended. After determining that murdering sex workers was his vocation in life, Rifkin began to murder more frequently. On July 14, 1991, the body of Barbara Jacobs, aged 31 at the time of her death, was discovered inside a plastic bag placed in a cardboard box in the East River. On September 1, 1991, Rifkin murdered Mary Ellen DeLuca, aged 22, after she complained about having sex with Rifkin after he purchased cocaine for her consumption. On September 23rd, Rifkin strangled Yun Lee, aged 31, and put her body into the East River. In early December 1991, Rifkin murdered an unidentified prostitute, placing her body inside of a 55-gallon drum and dumping it into the East River. Lorraine Orvieto, aged 28, worked as a prostitute in Bayshore, Long Island, when Rifkin picked her up, had sex with her, and strangled her to death. He disposed of her body in an oil drum and disposed of that drum in the Coney Island River. Orvieto's body would not be discovered until months later. On January 2, 1992, Rifkin murdered Mary Ann Holloman and stuffed her corpse into an oil drum in Coney Island Creek. Her body would not be discovered for another year. On Mother's Day weekend, May 10, 1992, Rifkin murdered Iris Sanchez, aged 25, then put her body under an old mattress in an illegal dump area near the JFK International Airport. On May 13, 1992, Rifkin murdered a yet unidentified female and placed her remains in an oil drum and floated it into Newton Creek in Brooklyn, New York. On May 25, 1992, Rifkin strangled Anna Lopez, aged 33 and mother of 3 children, then disposed of her remains along I-84 in Putnam County. In June of 1992, Rifkin murdered Violet O'Neill, aged 21, in the bathtub of his mother's home. He then wrapped her body parts in plastic and disposed of them and the parts in rivers and canals in and around New York City. O'Neill's torso was found floating in the Hudson River, where her other body parts were later discovered inside a suitcase. On October 2, 1992, Rifkin murdered Mary Catherine Williams, aged 31, at his mother's house, later dumping her remains in Yorktown, New York, in December. Rifkin then strangled Jenny Soto, aged 23, on November 16, 1992, with her body being discovered floating in the Harlem River in New York City a day later. A mother of 2 small children, Leah Evans, aged 28, died on February 27, 1993, at the hands of Rifkin, who buried her corpse in the woods on Long Island. Authorities discovered her body 3 months later. Lauren Marquez, aged 28, was murdered on April 2, 1993, and Rifkin left her body in the Pine Barrens in Suffolk County, New York, Long Island. And Rifkin strangled Tiffany Bresciani, aged 22, on June 24, 1993, putting her body into his mother's garage for 3 sweltering days before he disposed of the remains. On June 28, 1993, at approximately 3 a.m., Rifkin decided to dispose of Bresciani's remains after swabbing his nose with Noxzema due to the hard smell of the decomposition. He wrapped the corpse in plastic and duct tape. Rifkin then put the body in the back of his pickup truck and got on the Southern State Highway headed south to Melville's Republic Airport, where he desired to dispose of the remains. After his capture, when the troopers questioned Rifkin, he stated that she was a prostitute that he had paid to have sex with, and then things went bad, and he killed her, and he was headed to the airport so that he could get rid of the body. After this admission, Rifkin asked the officers if he would need an attorney. After troopers Spargerin and Ruane arrested Rifkin, they drove him to police headquarters in Hempstead, New York, and after detectives questioned the suspect for a short while, he revealed that Bresciani was just the tip of the iceberg, and then offered to speak about the 17. After Rifkin decided to confess to his crimes, the detectives received a search warrant for Rifkin's mother's house and discovered a plethora of evidence against Rifkin, including, but not limited to, women's driver's licenses, women's underwear, jewelry, prescription drug bottles, purses and wallets, photographs of women, makeup, hair accessories, and women's clothing. Mostly all of the evidence could be matched to the victims that Rifkin already named in his confession. He also had a large collection of true crime books, mostly on serial killers, and a rather large collection of pornographic movies and photographs. Most of the printed material regarded sadism. When the authorities searched the garage in the Rifkin residence, they discovered a negligible amount of blood in a wheelbarrow, bloody tools, and a chainsaw with human flesh and blood on the blades. With the evidence, Rifkin's rendition of the events, the missing person reports, and unidentified bodies over the last 4 years, 15 of the 17 victims had been positively identified. Nassau County indicted Joel Rifkin for the 15 murders, and when his mother hired an attorney, Rifkin abruptly fired him. Rifkin then hired Michael Sosnick, a former Nassau County district attorney who other attorneys held in great esteem, and John Lawrence, who was Sosnick's partner, who had no criminal experience whatsoever. Nassau County arraigned Rifkin for the murder of Tiffany Bresciani, and he pled not guilty. Like with most killers who have been caught, Rifkin's attorneys attempted to get his confession suppressed and the traffic stop by the troopers thrown out of court. Sosnick argued that the troopers had no probable cause to search the vehicle, thus finding the body of Tiffany Bresciani. The suppression hearing began in November 1993. 2 months into the hearing's proceedings, Sosnick turned down an offer from the prosecution to a plea deal where Rifkin would only serve 46 years to life in exchange for a guilty plea in the 17 murders. Rifkin refused the offer and suggested to his attorneys that they plead him not guilty by reason of insanity. During the long, drawn-out process of these suppression hearings, Sosnick showed up later to court dates and sometimes never showed up at all. Judge Ira Wexner became very tired of Sosnick's behavior and ended the hearings and set the trial date for April 11, 1994. Rifkin steadily became disenchanted with Sosnick's reputation and fired the attorney outright, but kept Lawrence, although the attorney did not have a great deal of experience with criminal proceedings. With an experienced yet disorganized attorney gone, and even though Rifkin pled not guilty by reason of insanity, the jury did not take long to find Rifkin guilty of murder and reckless endangerment. Judge Wexner sentenced Rifkin to 25 years to life. In Suffolk County, the court tried Rifkin for the murders of Evans and Marquez. This time, the convicted murderer pled guilty to an additional term of 25 years to life. Subsequently, Rifkin faced the same charges for different murders he committed in Queens and Brooklyn. When he stood convicted of those murders as well, Rifkin became known as the most prolific serial killer in New York history, as the juries in those counties found him guilty of 9 counts of murder. When all is said and done, Rifkin was sentenced to 203 years in prison. He is currently housed at the Clinton Correctional Facility in Clinton County, New York, and there he stays.
A subsequent FBI profile of Joel Rifkin surmised that he relished at the suffering of others. Rifkin had been driven to kill through pleasure and not anger and revenge, perhaps, although he experienced a great deal of bullying when he was younger. The abuse merely served to advance his behavior through withdrawal, and he saw the only refuge to satisfy his most darkest desires. He was a psychosexual sadist that derived pleasure in the planning and execution of his aspirations to murder. What motivates a child to commit the ultimate act of murder? Is it the results of a cruel and sometimes demeaning upbringing? Or is it simply a fascination with seeing others suffer in excruciating agony? With the profile that we present here, it serves as a prime example of an abhorrent fantasy run amok, culminating in the deaths of children and the incarceration of what can only be considered a human monster.
Born on November 19, 1859, the second son to Charles and Ruth Pomeroy, Jesse Harding Pomeroy grew up in one of the worst slums in South Boston. Jesse's father was a known alcoholic who had a mean temper with drink. In one of these states of drunkenness, Charles used a horsewhip on young Jesse because the youth committed truancy. Often Charles Pomeroy would bring his children behind the outhouse for beatings so severe that they would bleed. More times than not, Charles stripped the children naked before beating them, causing, perhaps, Jesse to associate the beatings with sexual satisfaction along with pain and punishment. The Pomeroy household seemed to lack pets due to the fact that bizarre and violent things would happen to them. Ruth Pomeroy wanted to have a set of lovebirds in the house, but remembered the last birds that entered the Pomeroy household would wind up with their heads being twisted off. Furthermore, young Jesse was discovered torturing the neighbor's cat. Thereafter, Ruth Pomeroy would not allow animals in the house. Like many other killers over time, the torturing of animals became blasé to young Jesse. He soon began looking to try his torture skills with humans. Being a big child for his age, Jesse looked for victims that were less than his stature, figuring they would be easier to subdue. His first known victim was a young boy named William Payne. On Christmas Day 1871, 2 men working their way through the snow near a cabin on Powderhorn Hill, Chelsea in Boston, recounted, "When we approached the cabin, we heard a whimpering cry. The sounds then grew louder and clearer. When we opened the door, we saw a little boy, no older than perhaps 4 years old, hanging by his wrists from the center beam of the outhouse. He appeared very pale, as the weather was pretty harsh that winter. His lips were blue. His hands looked purple due to the blood trapped by the bindings. The skin on the rest of his body appeared shockingly white. When the two men cut the young boy down from his bindings, they noticed the massive welts on his back. Immediately, they knew the brutality with which he suffered that day. Billy Payne could not identify his attacker, and the police marked the incident as isolated. In February of 1872, Tracy Hayden, age 7, was enticed by Pomeroy to accompany him to Powderhorn Hill to, quote, see the soldiers, end quote. Once Pomeroy isolated the young boy, he beat him mercilessly, knocking out the child's front teeth and blackening his eyes, before stripping him of his clothes, torturing the helpless boy as he did young Billy Payne, and threatening to cut off his genitals. Again, Hayden could not identify his attacker. Now, all the police knew was that there was a deviant on their hands and they must act fast to capture whomever it may be. In the early spring of 1872, Pomeroy struck again when he promised 8-year-old Robert Mayer he would take him to see the Barnum Circus. Once Pomeroy reached his favorite torture spot, he leapt upon the young Mayer, subduing him, stripping off his clothing, and beating him with a stick. Mayer noticed that Pomeroy pleasured himself with the swing of the switch that tore into the flesh of the young boy's body. Furthermore, and even more strangely, Pomeroy had Mayer recite swear words the whole time he administered the beating. Allegedly, at about the time that Pomeroy achieved orgasm, he freed the young Mayer and threatened that he would kill the youth if he spoke a word of the incident to anyone. By this time, the parents in and around Boston became enraged at law enforcement that they were unable to locate this fiend abducting, beating, and humiliating young children. In a dragnet to bring in all, quote, brown-haired young boys, end quote, as described by the victims, the police failed to find the youth responsible for the terror. The newspapers of the day branded Pomeroy the, quote, inhuman scamp, end quote, and touted the young pervert as a bogeyman that scoured the back streets and wildernesses surrounding South Boston in search of victims. The police mistakenly issued a new description of the monster as having red hair with a red beard, when in actuality, Pomeroy had been described as a smooth-skinned young boy with the complexion matching more of a young female. In July of 1872, Pomeroy attacked again. This time his victim was a 7-year-old boy. Pomeroy kept with his signature and again stripped the boy naked, beat him, and then achieved some height of sexual pleasure from watching the young child writhe in pain. Pomeroy left the young boy with the usual threats and escaped into the nearby woods. The Boston Globe opined that, quote, it is a good thing for the inhuman scamp that his identity is unknown just now, end quote. After this editorial appeared, and quite by coincidence, Ruth Pomeroy decided to move the family from Chelsea to South Boston. Whether it be for economic reasons or not, Mrs. Pomeroy decided a change necessary for her and the children. Historians have estimated that she must have known that her son may have been involved with the recent rash of attacks, but she remained fatally loyal to her son and never once believed he could have been responsible for the attacks that paralyzed the parents with fear in the area. A young, sickly 7-year-old boy wandered along the South Boston shoreline, as young boys will do, trying to discover some buried treasure or some lost artifact that would make him rich and famous. George Pratt, during his search, ran into a boy, Pomeroy, slightly older than he, who offered him 25 cents if he would help the older boy with an errand. Little George accepted the offer and went off with Pomeroy, never suspecting that this generous youth meant him any harm. When George and the older boy arrived at a secluded place, Pomeroy subdued George, stripped him naked, tied him up, and began torturing him. However, the attack took on a more brutal facet as the attacker bit George's cheek, extracting a large portion of flesh as he did so. Then the attacker, over George's painful cries, clawed viciously at the young boy's skin with his own fingernails. Then, when he thought the young boy could take no more, Pomeroy brandished a sewing needle and stabbed deeply into George's flesh. Pomeroy hoped to obtain a little more pain within the youth when he attempted to stab the boy in the eye with the needle. George managed to roll over on his stomach and prevented any further injury. Thus, Pomeroy fled, leaving little George tied up in the small wooden structure. But before leaving, Pomeroy bit deeply into the young boy's flesh, tearing a piece of his buttocks away from the victim's body. Approximately a month after the George Pratt assault, Pomeroy wrangled another victim, and it became obvious that his intentions became more depraved. He lured a 6-year-old boy named Harry Austin to another secluded spot and, just like his previous victims, stripped the boy down. But this time, Pomeroy's points of torture became more concentrated. Instead of a needle, Pomeroy pulled out a knife and viciously stabbed young Harry in the armpits and between the shoulder blades. At just that moment, Pomeroy attempted to excise Harry's private parts, but something startled him and he fled the scene. It appeared that Pomeroy's attacks escalated in their cruelty and regularity, as in under a week, Pomeroy was on the hunt again. This time, he lured a 7-year-old named Joseph Kennedy to the marshes near the bay. Pomeroy beat the young boy within an inch of his life, then demanded that Kennedy kneel and recite the Lord's Prayer. Not just the Lord's Prayer, but a parody with pornographic language. Kennedy refused, and Pomeroy first cut Kennedy across the face, then dragged the boy to the bay where he washed out his wounds with salt water. Pomeroy then fled. Less than a week after the Kennedy attack, Robert Gould, 5 years old, was discovered lashed to a post near the railroad tracks near South Boston. Gould related the story of an older boy that lured him away from his home with promises of, quote, going to see the soldiers, end quote. After beating Gould severely, Pomeroy then slashed the boy's head with a knife. But this time, Gould provided a better description of his assailant than previous victims and greatly assisted the police in finding the culprit of all of these attacks. Gould described his attacker as an older boy, quote, with an eye like white marble, end quote. Police now believed they had an ample lead and set about to discover the identity of their, quote, inhuman scamp, end quote. On September 21, 1872, police took Joseph Kennedy to every elementary school in South Boston to try and identify his attacker. For some reason, Kennedy was unable to do so, but unknown to the police, Pomeroy would be within their grasp, as for some unknown reason, he walked into the police station where Joseph Kennedy sat waiting for the police to finish with him. Throughout the rest of his life, Pomeroy never expressed any feelings of remorse for the cruel and brutal actions he took on young children, and at the time when he strolled into the police station, he would not experience those emotions either. Historians and criminologists have hypothesized that Pomeroy may have been playing some sort of sick game in his head with the police. Most serial killers inject themselves into the investigation, or they write letters describing certain aspects of the crime that only the killer or the police would know. Or perhaps, deep down inside, he wanted to get caught. When Pomeroy saw Kennedy within the police station, he immediately turned around and headed toward the exit to the street. By that time, it was too late. Kennedy saw Pomeroy from across the room and identified his attacker to police. Authorities placed Pomeroy into a cell, then tried to extract a confession from him, but the young man refused to say anything, proclaiming his innocence the whole time during the investigation. In those days, before Miranda v. Arizona 1966, police could do those sorts of things where they refused the suspect access to legal help and even held suspects for long periods of time, hoping they would eventually crack. The police waited well after midnight and tried to get a confession from Pomeroy again. They threatened him with a 100-year sentence if he didn't confess. At that point, Pomeroy confessed his crimes. The next day, the police were able to assemble all of the victims where they made a positive identification that Pomeroy was the boy who attacked and tortured them. Pomeroy appeared before a magistrate on that afternoon where his victims recounted their attacks. Ruth Pomeroy also took the stand in defense of her son where she claimed, quote, he was a good boy, obedient and hardworking, end quote. When asked if he had anything to say for himself, Pomeroy merely stated, quote, I just couldn't help myself, end quote. The judge's sentence was swift and, considering the institution to which he would be sentenced, merciless. Pomeroy would serve his sentence at the House of Reformation at Westboro until he reached the age of majority, 18. In dealing with juvenile delinquents, especially those as cantankerous and violent as Pomeroy, military discipline, hard work, and training for a trade were the remedies. Westboro became a, quote, house of horrors, end quote, so to speak, where malfactor young boys were sentenced to reform. Unfortunately, and like most other reform schools at the time, stronger, bullyish boys preyed upon the weaker of the population. In Westboro, though, more nonviolent boys were placed. In essence, the vicious mentalities, such as the one that Pomeroy possessed, flourished as he did prey on the weaker of the group. Pomeroy thought desperately as to how he could be discharged before his 18th birthday. During his tenure at Westboro, Pomeroy stood out as a model prisoner and convinced the school officials that he truly reformed his ways under their tutelage. His time there was not without expressing the violent behavior that saw his incarceration. After being there a year, Pomeroy was approached by one of the teachers who stated she saw a snake. Pomeroy, anxious to show his reformed ways, volunteered to handle the snake for her. He picked up a stick, found the snake, and then beat the snake to a bloody mess on the ground, whipping himself into a heated rage. Ruth Pomeroy, still convinced of her son's innocence, conducted a letter-writing campaign to the Westboro Board of Reformers, desperately trying to convince them that her son was not capable of such travesties. But it was not her consistent and habitual letter-writing that got her son released. It was her son himself. When investigators from the state of Massachusetts visited the Pomeroy residence, they determined that Ruth Pomeroy was a hard-working woman, and her other son, Charles, was an industrious and entrepreneurial young man, having established a large paper route and operated a newspaper stand out of his mother's dress shop. With this report and the recommendation of even the Boston police that Pomeroy had suffered enough, less than 2 years after his arrest, state officials released him from Westboro. One of the things that authorities failed to do, and would have eventually saved the lives of other children, was to warn the Pomeroy neighbors that the youth who so brutally tortured several children before the age of 13 was now released on the public. Pomeroy had been freed no less than 6 weeks when one morning, March 18, 1874, he walked across the street from his mother's home to open her dress shop and his brother's newsstand. At about this time, a young errand boy that Ruth Pomeroy used, Rudolph Corr, came to the shop to see if his services were needed that morning. Pomeroy and Corr spoke for a little while. At approximately 8:20 a.m., a pretty young 10-year-old neighborhood girl in a green and black plaid dress named Katie Curran entered the shop to inquire as to whether the store inventory included notebooks. A new teacher at school was starting that day, and Katie was excited about her first day with the new teacher and decided that she needed a new notebook for the class. The little girl stated to Pomeroy that she had to be back at her house by 8:30 in order to walk her little sister to school. With his one good eye, Pomeroy looked at the young girl and then turned to Corr, gave him a few coins, and asked if the young man would go to the local butcher shop down the street to purchase some scraps of meat for the cat. Pomeroy then turned to Katie and stated that his mother kept a store downstairs and there was a notebook that had a huge ink stain on the front of it, and he would be willing to sell it to her for 2 cents less than the price on the cover. Katie acknowledged Pomeroy's unspoken invitation, and then the two went into the basement for the notebook. Later, in his own words, Pomeroy stated what happened next. "I followed her, put my arm around her neck, hand over her mouth, and with my knife cut her throat. I then dragged her behind the water closet, laying her head furthest upon the place, and I put some stones and some ashes over the body." What Pomeroy failed to mention in a later statement was that he nearly severed Katie's head from her body, and the body exhibited a severe state of decomposition by the time the authorities found her. Her dress had huge slices going up the front. It became evident that Pomeroy brutalized the young woman in a sexual way. By the time he completed his gory work, Pomeroy heard his brother enter the store. He then washed his hands at a pipe coming from the water closet and then hurried back upstairs as if nothing ever happened. Katie Curran's mother, Mary, became very concerned when her daughter failed to return home after trying to procure the notebook. Katie never left the house without telling her mother where she was going and was not the sort of child just to run off. Mary Curran visited Tobin's General Store and spoke with the proprietor, who informed her that the girl had been there earlier, but because he was out of the notebook that Katie desired, he sent the girl over to Mrs. Pomeroy's store. At that time, Mary Curran shuddered with uncontrollable dread as she heard the stories about young Jesse Pomeroy and feared the worst. Mary Curran actually fainted when Tobin told her the distressing news. Once news of the girl's disappearance got around the neighborhood, everyone thought the worst. With Mary Curran visibly shaken, she visited the local police precinct to voice her concerns. She met with Captain Henry Dyer, who assured the worried mother that, quote, "I understand that he was completely rehabilitated in reform school. Besides, he only hurts little boys. He never attacked a girl," end quote. The police tried to quell Mary Curran's worries with a belittling address and stated that Katie probably got lost and would return home later that evening. Rudolph Corr saw Mary Curran the next day and reported to her that he saw Katie in the Pomeroy store the day she disappeared. Mary Curran made a second visit to the police station, where she again met with Captain Dyer, who assured her that Rudolph Corr had a reputation of being a liar. But to soothe her worry, Captain Dyer sent a Detective Adams to the Pomeroys to inquire as to her daughter's whereabouts. When Detective Adams visited the Pomeroy store, an angry Ruth Pomeroy met the detective at the door, saying she understood that her son was suspected, but allowed the detective to search the store anyway. After a brief, cursory look, Detective Adams left the store with his apologies toward Mrs. Pomeroy. For the next few weeks, police tried to follow every lead that came their way in the Curran case, even that her father forced the girl out of town to attend a convent. The father was Catholic and Mary Curran was Protestant. Anti-Catholic fervor ran high in Boston in those days, so no one would tremor if that were the resolution to the Curran case. Eventually, with the exception of Mary Curran, talk of the case died down. A few weeks later, not being able to control his urges, Pomeroy lured a 5-year-old boy by the name of Harry Field into a doorway off Vernon Street. About the time when Pomeroy was about to commit his crime, an old acquaintance from his old neighborhood happened by, and Pomeroy and he engaged in an argument. While the two argued, little Harry yanked his hand away from Pomeroy's and managed to escape. When he ran home, Harry burst open the door and literally jumped into his mother's arms, crying and unable to speak. Pomeroy's next victim would not be that lucky. In April of 1874, the Millen family moved onto Dorchester Street, just across the way from the Curran family. The Millen family's youngest child, Horace, was 4 years old, dark eyes, and, quote, shiny blonde locks, end quote. On one particular day, April 22, 1874, Horace dressed in a black and white jacket, a red and white check shirt with velvet trim, a black velvet hat with a gold tassel, and black knickers. Horace was known to love sweet confectionaries, and, on this day, his mother gave him some coins and sent him on his way to a local bakery. On the way there, he met an older boy who tempted him with sweets. The two boys then journeyed hand in hand together to a local sweet shop where Horace bought a small cake and shared it with the older boy. The older boy, of course Pomeroy, suggested that the two take a walk to the nearby harbor to see a new steamship docked there. The two left the shop hand in hand and walked to the nearest harbor. Witnesses reported seeing the two boys, with the older boy exhibiting an almost uncontrollable excitement as the two traveled together. But they never reported it, seeing that the older boy looked very responsible and didn't worry that any harm would come to young Horace. Although those that witnessed the two together thought it strange that a boy dressed so formally would be in that part of town, they did not think twice, as it appeared the two boys were brothers. When Pomeroy and Horace crossed a ditch close to the harbor, they ran into a boy a little older than Pomeroy, Robert Benson, who was digging for clams. Gunshots could be heard in the distance, and Pomeroy asked the clam-digging teenager why they heard gunshots. Benson replied that people were duck hunting in the marshy part of the area. Pomeroy and Horace then walked away from the harbor to a more secluded area. When they arrived at a ditch in the wilderness, away from any prying eyes, Pomeroy wanted to rest. So Horace sat down, and in a swift movement that caught the young boy off guard, Pomeroy took out his knife, the same one he used on Katie Curran, and in a swift, brutal stroke, sliced open Horace's throat. Horace surprised Pomeroy due to the fact that after such a deep and blood-gushing wound, he was still alive. Pomeroy then made a frenzied attack, stabbing the young boy over and over again. Horace fought back, but eventually Pomeroy sliced through the boy's windpipe, extinguishing his life. When the attack concluded, Pomeroy stabbed Horace Millen over 15 times. A later examination of Horace's body revealed that his eye had been punctured through the eyelid and his pubic area suffered extreme mutilations. From all indications, Horace Millen, the innocent young boy whose family had just moved to a new home, died an excruciating death at the hands of Jesse Pomeroy. Authorities later determined that Horace Millen died at approximately 12 noon. At approximately 4 p.m., Millen's body would be found by two brothers playing on the beach nearby, who later retrieved the men hunting ducks, who, in turn, watched over the corpse until the police could be summoned. John Millen, Horace's father, went to the local police station at approximately 5:30 p.m. and reported that his son never returned home from a trip to a local sweet shop. The police made note of what the boy was wearing at the time of his disappearance and then stated they would be on the lookout for young Horace. The police would later discover that the boy's mutilated remains had already been discovered and brought to the coroner for an examination. After a coroner's jury assembled and made the determination as to the cause of death, several newspaper reporters who gathered for the proceeding wrote their stories and disseminated the information, whereupon police sent out bulletins to neighboring departments. Finally, an officer arrived at the Millen home to deliver the news regarding the death of their son. When contemplating what type of individual could do this to a young child, the answer became clear to those who knew the signature of the killer and the past tortures of young males and females. Jesse Pomeroy was the answer. But at that time, newspapermen and authorities believed the deviant tormentor of young children was still locked away in Westboro Reform School, unaware that Satan's spawn had already been released almost a year before. Police dispatched officers to the Pomeroy home where they found Jesse Pomeroy, and against his mother's protests and Pomeroy's affirmations that he had done nothing wrong, authorities took the young man into custody. Pomeroy sustained a barrage of questions from the police, but one thing stood out to the inquisitive lawman. Pomeroy could not account for his time between 11 a.m. and 3 p.m. on the day that Horace Millen disappeared. Additionally, when the police first arrested the youth, he had, in his possession, quote, a knife spotted with blood. A spot marked the breast of his undershirt, and his boots were covered with mud of that particular hue and consistency that belongs alone to the soil of the marshlands, end quote. Jesse Pomeroy maintained his innocence until approximately noon on the following day, April 23, 1874. Pomeroy confessed wholeheartedly to the murder of Horace Millen. After the frustration that authorities exhibited as a result of Pomeroy's steadfast denials and defying the police to prove his culpability in the Millen murder, one of the detectives, stifled by Pomeroy's protestations of innocence, brought the boy to the undertaker in charge of the arrangements for the burial of little Horace. When the detective pulled back the sheet covering the little boy's face, the detective forced Pomeroy to look at the mangled body of this once attractive youth and then asked Pomeroy if he knew the little boy. Pomeroy responded that he knew him. When asked if he killed him, Pomeroy responded, quote, I suppose I did, end quote. This was the first and only time that Pomeroy would show remorse for his diabolical actions. At this time, authorities and the public began to ask, where is Katie Curran? On the 27th of April, 1874, arraignment for Pomeroy was held in the Highlands Municipal Court, where Pomeroy stood charged with the murder of Horace Millen. The coroner requested that the young man not answer to any of the charges until a more thorough investigation could be made of the Millen murder and any other substantial leads that the authorities may investigate. Furthermore, the boy did not have the advantage of present counsel. The judge agreed with the coroner and determined that any further proceedings should be postponed. By the end of the month, authorities held no doubt that Jesse Pomeroy, in fact, murdered Horace Millen. In July of 1874, while Pomeroy waited in jail to determine the course that authorities would take, his mother decided that the family should move from their present location. Ruth Pomeroy became weary of the constant stares and under-breath murmurs around South Boston. When she and her other son, Charles, moved, her former co-tenant decided to expand his business. This meant that the basement of the Pomeroy's former shop would have to be expanded. It did not take long for the workmen to find the badly decomposed remains of Katie Curran. Authorities arrested Ruth and Charles Pomeroy, partly due to some leverage in order to get Pomeroy to confess to the murder of Katie Curran, and partly for protective custody, fearing that a mob would attempt to lynch the two and blame the mother for her son's atrocious behavior. A subsequent examination of Katie Curran's corpse revealed that she suffered similar wounds to that of Horace Millen, and police exhibited no doubt that Jesse Pomeroy murdered the young girl. Authorities gave Jesse Pomeroy 2 days with which to think over whether he would confess or not. The arrest of Ruth and Charles did not seem to have any effect on him, but soon he realized that they would pay for his crimes if he did not confess. Therefore, he confessed to the murder of Katie Curran with accuracy. So accurate, in fact, that seasoned homicide detectives cringed when Pomeroy discussed the means by which he murdered the young girl. When asked why he killed the girl, Pomeroy simply answered, quote, "I just wanted to see how she would act," end quote. At this point, Pomeroy appeared to be culpable in 2 murders. Pomeroy's only option at this point was to prove that he was insane, not a medical term, but a legal one. Thus, the confessed murderer fell under the standard of the McNaughton rules. In England in the 1830s, Daniel McNaughton murdered the secretary of the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Robert Peel. When McNaughton stood trial, the jury was disturbed that he was mentally unstable and did not have it in their consciences to hang a sick man. So instead of hanging, they sentenced the troubled young man to a mental institution. The McNaughton rules established that a jury or judge must determine whether the accused understood the charges against him, was he able to assist in his own defense, or did he or she understand the difference between right and wrong at the time of the commission of the crime. Because of the seriousness of the crimes and the obvious depravity Pomeroy used while torturing and then killing his victims, the public clamored for justice and demanded that the accused child killer be executed. However, in order to save his life, his attorneys believed that they could bargain for a lesser sentence if they could prove that their client was insane. 3 alienists were called to examine the young man, and in the first few sessions with the mental health professionals, he freely admitted to torturing young children and then killing them. After Pomeroy received a note from his mother, he stopped talking as freely with the doctors. Approximately 2 months before his trial, Pomeroy denied any wrongdoing and recanted his confessions in front of Dr. John Tyler, one of the 3 alienists. In essence, Dr. Tyler concluded that Pomeroy showed no remorse for his actions, and Jesse could discriminate between right and wrong. The boy was, and forever would be, a threat to society. He needed to be carefully restrained of his liberty that others may not be endangered. Therefore, Dr. Tyler surmised, Jesse Pomeroy was insane. Charles Robinson, Pomeroy's attorney, hoped to keep Pomeroy out of prison. Pomeroy, on the other hand, hoped to do a short jail stint and then be allowed to join the Navy, where they would show him discipline. Pomeroy's trial began on December 8, 1874, and made headlines all over the nation. However, unlike some trials in the present day, this trial did not take very long. The jury was seated in less than an hour, and the prosecution's opening arguments took half that long. The prosecutor for the state, John May, brought witness after witness to the stand who placed Pomeroy with the 2 victims. When the state rested, Robinson opened his arguments with the tragic life of his client, perhaps in an effort to get the jury to show Pomeroy some mercy. Robinson related how Pomeroy could not control his impulses and felt compelled to torture and murder. During both the prosecution and defense cases, Pomeroy sat with his hands clasped behind his neck, looking unconcerned as to his fate. Robinson laid the foundation for an insanity defense and called layman witnesses to testify to the fact. The 2 defense alienists who examined Pomeroy testified that the defendant, in fact, was insane. The prosecution's alienist, Dr. George T. Choate, testified that although Pomeroy was cunning and cruel, he could find no sign of insanity. On December 9, 1874, after closing arguments, the jury went into deliberations. After 5 hours of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict: guilty of murder in the first degree with premeditation. The mandatory sentence for this crime in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts was certainly death by hanging. But because of the defendant's age, the jury asked that clemency be given to the young man. Only the governor of the state could grant that type of clemency. The question of commutation was left to the governor of the state. Because of post-trial motions, sentencing was delayed until mid-February 1875, when Judge Horace Gray sentenced Pomeroy to death. Judge Gray ordered the guards to take Pomeroy to jail to await execution. Governor William Gaston formed a committee to answer the question as to whether such a young defendant should be executed. The committee met and came back to Governor Gaston hopelessly divided. The state's chief executive then had an open hearing where advocates and opponents could voice their opinions as to whether a 14-year-old boy should be executed. Governor Gaston listened to the arguments and stated that he would take the arguments under advisement and waited several weeks before even mentioning the case again. Governor Gaston did not want to execute Pomeroy, and this would cost him the election of 1876. His opponent in that race, Alexander Rice, pledged that he would see Pomeroy hang for his crimes. 2 years after murdering Katie Curran and Horace Millen, Governor Rice gathered his advisors and determined that the case was now too removed in time for anyone to really care, but that any punishment deemed upon Pomeroy must be severe. Governor Rice then sentenced Pomeroy to life imprisonment. To make the sentence more severe, Governor Rice ordered Pomeroy's sentence to be served for the rest of his life in solitary confinement at the state prison at Charlestown. Ruth Pomeroy was the only visitor that he received for years after his sentencing. The existence that Pomeroy endured in prison befitted the type of personality he developed. He ate alone, exercised alone, and spent countless hours in his cell reading the books that prison officials would allow him to digest. He often thought about escaping. Throughout his whole incarceration, Pomeroy maintained his innocence and that he was wrongly convicted. In 1917, after several governors had passed through the executive mansion in Boston, the restrictions first placed on Pomeroy through Governor Rice saw a relaxation, and Pomeroy joined the general population of Charlestown. When new inmates came to the prison as a result of being sentenced there, Pomeroy would approach them, introduce himself, and then, quote, ask them what they knew about him, end quote. Eventually, though, very few inmates coming to the prison in the following years had ever heard of Charlestown's most famous inmate. When Pomeroy's health began to fail, prison officials moved him from Charlestown to the Bridgewater Prison Farm in 1929, when Pomeroy reached the age of 71. In 1931, Pomeroy passed away, and the press dismissed him as the, quote, most friendless person in the world, end quote, and a psychopath.
Although Jesse Harding Pomeroy stood convicted of only 2 horrific murders, historians have contended that he may have been responsible for as many as 10 homicides committed the same way with the same signatures involved. The one problem we have as a society is trying to convince ourselves that perhaps children like Jesse Pomeroy are incapable of such horrendous crimes. But history either proves us wrong, or we become more sympathetic to the upbringing of such demonstrative displays of deviancy. We tend to blame atmosphere and even society as a whole when confronted with such dastardly deeds, such as a child who never realized the difference between right and wrong. Perhaps we see a fascination with the violence around us that makes these children, for lack of a better word, see what it is like to senselessly kill another human being. No matter how long we study this behavior, the answers seem to elude us, causing society to produce more and more of these, quote, lost, end quote, or forgotten children who seek the attention that infamy provides.
The case of a missing boy. In today's world, that particular travesty would garner the utmost attention from the authorities, knowing what fate may possibly await the child. But one case received the wrong type of attention where the mother was deemed insane and forced to be institutionalized, when the only thing she wanted was to find her missing son. What transpired was to shock the world in its deviance and the enabling forces that allowed certain crimes to continue. On February 2, 1928, LA County Sheriff's deputies discovered a headless corpse in a burlap sack in the La Puente ditch. The teenager appeared to have been shot through the heart with a small caliber firearm. On March 28, 1928, Christine Collins gave her son, Walter Collins, some money to attend the cinema. The boy was last seen at 5 p.m. on that day by a neighbor at the corner of Pasadena Avenue and North Avenue 23 in Lincoln Heights in Los Angeles. Christine had been raising her son ever since her husband stood incarcerated in Folsom State Prison for robbery. The Los Angeles Police Department had been called out for the numerous scandals they had been involved with at this time. Christine Collins repeatedly urged the LAPD to help her find her son. However, for some reason, with the Collins case, LAPD Police Chief James Davis succumbed to a great deal of pressure to solve this case. Walter's father believed that some inmates in Folsom kidnapped his son in order to gain some sort of revenge on him for one reason or another. Walter's father's function at the prison was working in the cafeteria, where he was obligated to report any infractions of the rules that the various inmates may execute. Although there were several leads to find the child, nothing panned out. One interesting facet of the case occurred when a local gas station attendant in Glendale, California, Richard Struthers, stated that he saw the body of a young dead boy wrapped in newspaper in the back of a car when a foreign couple stopped to ask for directions. Another man, C.V. Staley, followed the couple after they left the gas station, and they eventually lost Staley when they sped out of town. When the authorities later showed Struthers and Staley photos of Walter Collins, they both identified the boy in the back of the car as indeed little Walter. Other reports came in that a couple traveled throughout California with a young boy in the back of their car who kept screaming to be released. Additionally, at approximately the same time, on May 16, 1928, two brothers, Nelson and Louis Winslow, 10 and 12-year-olds respectively, went missing while on their way home in Pomona, California. Strangely, the parents received letters from the two stating that they were heading to Mexico, and the second letter stated they were going to stay there until they became famous. At first, the authorities did not believe the Collins and Winslow cases demonstrated any connections, nor did they see any similarities between the Collins, Winslow, and the case of the headless corpse that they found in the La Puente ditch. There were reports, however, of a neighbor who witnessed a poultry farmer in Wineville, California, who had been mistreating a boy at his farm. Authorities also did not believe this connected to the other three cases as well. In August of 1928, Illinois police picked up a young boy who identified himself as Arthur Kent. When asked where the boy was from, he stated that his father abandoned the family, so authorities placed little Arthur in the care of a foster family until other relatives of the boy surfaced. After a few days, Arthur told the police his name was Walter Collins and he came from Los Angeles, and he had been avoiding their questions to protect his father. The Illinois police contacted the Los Angeles police and even sent photos of the boy claiming to be Walter. Eventually, the boy claiming to be Walter arrived in Los Angeles, and Christine Collins immediately stated that the young child was not her son. After some cajoling from LAPD Captain J.J. Jones, Christine tried out the young boy as her son. 3 weeks after the young boy claiming to be Walter stayed with Christine, she strolled into the local police precinct with her son's dental records and signed affidavits from people who knew Walter, stating that the imposter was not her son. Captain Jones immediately referred to Christine as a lunatic and attempted to get the state of California to take over custody of the boy, and he truly believed she tried to embarrass the LAPD. Christine's actions were not meant to put the LAPD in a bad light. They were already there regarding their handling of the case thus far. Captain Jones then had Christine committed to a psychiatric ward at the Los Angeles County General Hospital on what was known as a Code 12, where police could commit what they termed troublemakers by throwing them into insane asylums. As Christine sat in the psychiatric ward in September 1928, a Canadian woman named Winifred Clark communicated with American authorities and stated that her nephew kidnapped and held her son, Sanford Wesley Clark, somewhere in California. Jessie Clark, Wesley's 15-year-old sister, became worried when her brother ventured 2 years before to live with her uncle, Gordon Stewart Northcott, age 21 at the time. Jessie then went to Northcott's farm in Wineville, California, just to make a wellness visit for her brother. Jessie learned disturbing things occurred at the farm and became very alarmed when she witnessed Northcott physically abusing her brother and believed that her uncle was involved in something very strange. At this point, when Jessie expressed her fears, Northcott abused her as well. Urged to speak with police, Sanford spoke with officers and related that his uncle did kidnap him, abuse him physically, and abuse him sexually. Sanford also related with much horror how he witnessed the torture and murder of other young boys at the farm, specifically the murders of Walter Collins, Nelson Winslow, and Lewis Winslow, along with other boys. At times, Sanford stated that his uncle forced him to participate with the abuse and the murders. Northcott, according to his nephew, abducted young boys to sexually abuse them, and when he got bored, he would lead them into the incubator room to see hatchling chicks, and then he murdered them with an axe. Northcott later covered the bodies with quicklime to enhance decomposition, then buried them. Sanford also tried to help the police in stating that he did kill a young Latino boy in La Puente. Sadly, both Sanford and Northcott murdered Walter Collins. The reason for Walter's death, according to the authorities' newest witness, was that Walter witnessed Northcott assist in the murder of another man. Sanford then stated he would lead the police to the graves of the murdered boys near the chicken coop on the farm. Once the authorities went to the chicken farm, they located axes where hair, blood, and brain matter still clung to the blades. Further digging around the farm exposed graves loaded with human bones. The bones were later identified as those of male children. Inside of the Northcott house, the authorities discovered a book checked out by one of the Winslow boys. Whistles, Boy Scout uniforms, and other materials belonging to some of the known victims were found within the house as well. Letters to parents were also discovered, possibly composed for future abductions. With all the materials they found within the Northcott compound, nothing there at the time connected Walter Collins' disappearance to Northcott. The only thing authorities did not find at the Northcott farm was Northcott himself and his mother. They fled just as the police made their way to the farm. Northcott's father, Cyrus George Northcott, informed the police that his son already admitted to the murders before he and Louise Northcott left town. Cyrus Northcott knew his son exhibited a sort of perversion, and he and Louise Northcott purchased the farm for their son to work in the hopes that his habits would change. Most importantly, Cyrus Northcott informed police that Clark's story of the farm was trustworthy. Police arrested the elder Northcott and held him as a material witness. Although the LAPD kept insisting that Christine Collins had her son back, she refused to believe that this young changeling was her son. Only after the handwriting of little Walter and the changeling had been compared, it demonstrated that a great fraud had been perpetrated upon Christine Collins. After a while of continued questioning, the fake Walter admitted several aliases. This young boy, Arthur Hutchinson, assumed Collins' identity in an attempt to go to Hollywood to meet his then idol, Tom Mix. After this admission, Hutchinson's mother came out from Illinois and collected the boy from Los Angeles, returning home. Arthur Hutchinson had no remorse and lacked any contrition at portraying a missing child and playing a trick on a bereaved mother. Subsequent to Hutchinson's return to Illinois, hospital administrators released Christine Collins from their care. On September 21, 1928, with authorities in all the western states and Canada searching for him for weeks, Gordon Stewart Northcott was arrested in British Columbia along with his mother Louise. As the two sat in a Canadian jail, a grand jury in Los Angeles County indicted the two for murder and charged them accordingly. Throughout the ordeal of discovery and the fight for extradition, Northcott denied having anything to do with the murders. In December, LAPD authorities brought Northcott back to the farm, and upon arriving there, he verbally confessed to the 5 murders, including the Winslow brothers, Walter Collins, and a 15-year-old Mexican boy named Jose Ayala. The confession to Ayala's murder was taken down in written form. Louise Northcott confessed to delivering the final blow to Walter Collins with an axe. Mrs. Northcott then buried young Walter in a hole dug in the chicken coop. Police later discovered that Louise would do anything to help her son. That even involved murder. Sanford Clark stated that his grandmother related that if he even touched one of the boys, he would also be complicit in their deaths. The trial of the state of California versus Gordon Stewart Northcott began in January 1929. One of the bizarre facets of this case occurred when Northcott insisted that he represent himself rather than accept the representation of some very knowledgeable attorneys, especially those who had been involved with murder trials previously. Northcott complained that his life had been threatened while he awaited trial in jail. Although Northcott maintained that he may be insane, alienists Drs. W.B. Wells and Dr. M. Webster determined that the defendant exhibited no traits of insanity. As the old saying goes, he who represents himself has a fool for a client. Northcott demonstrated no acumen of courtroom decorum, nor any protocols when it came to questioning witnesses. Through Sanford Clark, Northcott hoped that his questioning of the youth would demonstrate that the bones found at the farm were those of animals rather than human. When the defendant asked the questions, he added to the witness's testimony that he remembered having 3 dogs on the farm that died and eventually buried them on the property. Later in the trial, when Northcott brought his mother to the stand to testify, Louise Northcott stated that she was not Gordon Northcott's mother. The defendant's real mother was Winifred Clark, the defendant's aunt. This caused a massive controversy within the court, but no other corroborating evidence surfaced during the trial to substantiate Mrs. Northcott's assertions. On February 8, 1929, after sending deputies on several wild goose chases to the farm time and again, Northcott stood convicted of 3 counts of murder and faced the gallows. When the jury reached their verdict, they recommended no mercy upon the defendant. The deputy district attorney at the time of the conviction, Earl Redwine, stated, "Northcott was the lowest of all humans, a diabolical wretch who was the worst fiend Riverside County ever had the misfortune to harbor. He has forfeited all right to live, but if I thought that life imprisonment meant life imprisonment, I might consider such a verdict." Redwine elaborated that in order for the people of California to make sure that Northcott received his just punishment, he must be sentenced to death, as a future parole board would release the killer back into society within a few years. The residents of California would not tolerate a monster walking on their street when he took the lives of innocent young children. The judge in the case actually agreed and sentenced Northcott to hang by the neck until he was dead. In September 1929, the California Supreme Court gave leave to Northcott's counsel to file briefs in favor of a new trial. The Supreme Court also ruled that the judge at the trial level should have appointed another counsel for the defendant after Northcott fired his attorney. Even though this may have been a procedural faux pas, the Supreme Court reluctantly denied a new trial for the murderer. The day before his scheduled execution, on October 1st, 1930, Christine Collins went to the prison to speak with Northcott regarding the disappearance of her son. Christine believed that her son was still alive and attempted to get any details from the convicted murder. Christine Collins stated that the interview with Northcott was worse than useless. Also on this day, Northcott said goodbye to his parents. At approximately 10 a.m., Gordon Stewart Northcott walked from the death cell to the foot of the gallows. The young murderer, who so defiantly stood before the court and denied any involvement in the murders of the young boys at his family farm, walked with limited bravery to the gallows and then began sobbing before climbing the steps. 3 prison guards had to take a firm grasp of the condemned man and escort him up the steps to his punishment. At 10:10 a.m., Northcott fell through the trap door, snapping his neck. At another part of the prison, his mother, Louise, could be heard sobbing uncontrollably. In 2008, Clint Eastwood directed the fact-based drama Changeling. The movie was based on the events surrounding the Wineville chicken coop murders, but focused on Christina Collins, who was portrayed by Angelina Jolie. Although the film focused on the struggle of Christina Collins, the murders were slightly center stage, as that was the reason young Walter disappeared. In examining the criminal behavior of Gordon Stewart Northcott, he would have not eluded law enforcement for long had his mother not enabled his behavior. Truly deviant, and one can say slightly demented, Northcott's psychopathy can only be characterized as a perverted proclivity. We've seen this before on True Crime Man's Dark Imagination, but never where cases intersected with such a powerful story of a mother who just wanted to find her missing son through a sea of corruption and incompetence. After the execution of her son, Sarah Louise Northcott spent 4.5 years at San Quentin Prison and the rest of her time at Talachpi Prison for Women, where she left in 1940. Louise Northcott then went to Maryland, where Cyrus had purchased a farm, and lived there until Cyrus died in April 1944, and Louise followed him in November, respectively. Subsequently, Christina Collins filed a lawsuit against J.J. Jones and won a judgment of $15,000. Unfortunately, a judgment that Jones never paid. Christina Collins died in 1964, never admitting that little Walter was dead.
Within the dark and mysterious underground of Hollywood, there lies many demons. Demons that consume the very soul of those seeking fame, fortune, and adventure. Young girls travel to the film capital of the world in the hopes of their discovery to star in major motion picture productions. One of these young girls sought to achieve fame through this manner, yet she would attain notoriety in Hollywood for an entirely different reason. She met one of those demons.
On the morning of January 15, 1947, suburban Los Angeles housewife Betty Bersinger left her home with her 3-year-old daughter on her way to run some errands. The two of them walked along Norton Avenue in Leimert Park at the south end of Los Angeles. Along the way, for their leisurely stroll, Bersinger and her daughter passed several vacant lots. The area where they walked had several of these lots, as a local developer had purchased the land in the hopes of building several speculation houses. Bersinger and her daughter approached the corner of 39th Street, and when they reached the corner, they noticed a large white object in the field adjacent to the street. At first, Bersinger believed it to be a mannequin, but as she got closer, she screamed and walked swiftly away from the scene with her daughter in tow. Immediately after arriving home, she telephoned the police and informed them of the discovery of a mutilated corpse. When the police arrived at the scene, they found the body of a young woman who had been severed in half just above the waist, and the corpse had been placed in different suggestive poses. Authorities noted that the body contained numerous small cuts, including one that sliced across her face, that ran from the corners of her mouth to her ears, giving her a disfigured grin. In the follow-up police report, Sergeant H.L. Hansen recorded what he observed surrounding the crime scene and stated that the body had been dead less than 10 to 12 hours, as rigor mortis had not set in. The body had been cleanly severed at the midline, and the lower half was lying about 1 foot to the south of the upper half. Sergeant Hansen noted that the crime scene lacked any blood, denoting that the corpse had been completely drained of blood before the body had been disposed. Because of the lack of blood, stains, or smears of blood on the body, it appeared that the corpse had been washed prior to disposal. One facet in particular caught the sergeant's attention. The mouth was badly slashed approximately 3 inches each way from the corners, and the upper lip was deeply lacerated on the right-hand side. The marks noted by Sergeant Hansen on the victim's face resembled a grotesque smile. Again, due to the lack of blood at the scene, detectives deduced that the victim had been killed elsewhere and moved to that scene. Additionally, investigators determined that the victim had been hanged by her wrists at some point and endured some excruciating torture prior to her death. The marks made on the body, noted by Sergeant Hansen, indicated that authorities were dealing with someone infatuated with necrophilia and knives. It appeared that a lustful, sadistic murderer was at large in the city of Los Angeles. The corpse also contained a rose tattoo on her upper left thigh. Immediately upon the discovery of the corpse, newspapermen and spectators alike swarmed the scene. The police desperately wanted to identify the victim, and with the help of the Los Angeles Herald-Express, used some new technology to get the fingerprints from the body to the FBI. This sound photo technology worked more like a fax machine, and the Los Angeles police were able to get the fingerprints to the top law enforcement agency in the country. Within 48 hours, an identification came back that would generate a mystery as to why she was killed and the identity of the perpetrator, generating many myths about the motive and means by which the young lady had been dispatched. The young woman identified with the fingerprints was Elizabeth Short, 22 years old, from Massachusetts. Investigating Elizabeth Short and her history would produce many leads and brought to the forefront the seedier side of life in Los Angeles in the 1940s. Born on July 29, 1924, Short grew up in a household of a mother and a father and 4 sisters. Short's father made a living designing and building golf courses, but abandoned the family when the Great Depression hit in 1929. Phoebe Short, Elizabeth's mother, then had to work several jobs in order to support her and her 5 daughters. During the course of her brief life, Elizabeth went by several nicknames: Betty, Bet, or Beth, and was often described by people who knew her as kind, pretty, and funny. Elizabeth had some distinctive features that made her stand out, predominantly her raven dark hair and bright blue eyes. With dreams of becoming a famous actress, Elizabeth moved to California to be with her father in the latter part of 1942. But the relationship soon became strained and she moved away, only to return a short while later with her concentration more aggressive in becoming a famous actress. Short's father, Cleo Short, stated that Elizabeth had a bad habit of running around, and he would not tolerate that type of behavior from his daughter. At the time that police interviewed Mr. Short, he appeared intoxicated and refused to appear at the coroner's office to substantiate his daughter's identity. When Elizabeth returned to Los Angeles, she worked as a waitress and dated several men and eventually fell into the partying lifestyle of the area. At the age of 19, Elizabeth was arrested, fingerprinted, and a mugshot taken for public intoxication and underage drinking. The mugshot was later used to confirm her identity after the discovery of her body. Elizabeth was last seen alive on January 9, 1947, and as the investigation intensified, more details of her tragic life would end up becoming public. At the time of her body's discovery and the sensationalism of the press at the time, they dubbed Elizabeth the Black Dahlia, due to the information that surfaced that had transformed from an innocent girl seeking fame in Hollywood to a woman whose romances changed her to a man-crazy delinquent. Most believe that the moniker originated with the film noir of the 1940s by that title, that told the story of a dark beauty who had a penchant for sheer black dresses. Others believed Elizabeth received the name due to her strikingly dark hair. The Los Angeles Times proclaimed that several of her co-workers came up with the nickname. Whatever the origins of this dark designation, it stuck and became infamous throughout crime history. On January 23, 1947, the Los Angeles Herald-Examiner received an anonymous telephone call from someone claiming to be the killer, complaining about the way the newspaper covered the story and then offered to send some of the victim's belongings to the newspaper. In the following next days, the Herald-Examiner received a package that contained Elizabeth Short's birth certificate, some photos, business cards, and an address book, along with a letter pasted together with magazine letter clippings that read, "Los Angeles Examiner and other Los Angeles papers, here is Dahlia's belongings." As the investigation into Elizabeth's demise continued, police received several hundred tips as to who may have been the perpetrator, but most of them could be discounted. Initially, and this has been half-heartedly discounted, that the person or persons who murdered Elizabeth Short had medical knowledge due to the precision cuts made to the body and the way she was bisected. Investigators then determined that in order to find Short's killer, they would have to canvass all over the country. It seemed that Short traveled all over the U.S. in search of a suitable climate for her condition. Short suffered from an acute bronchial condition that caused great discomfort. Authorities learned that Short once lived in Florida, Georgia, Long Beach, and Los Angeles, all in a search for the perfect environment for her malady. Short's reputation amongst the in-the-know sect of Hollywood confirmed that the raven-haired beauty saw no less than 4 men a day. She teased them, got rides from them, places to sleep, clothes, and money, but then refused to have sex with them. Once these facts became public, although her murder was horrific and sadistic, the public maintained that Short may have deserved such a mutilation with the way she treated men. Perhaps she ran into a man who would not take no for an answer, and then decided to take his revenge in desecrating her body in a very horrendous manner. Authorities estimated that Short knew at least 50 men, and 25 of them had been seen with the young girl within 60 days of her death. The reality of Elizabeth Short was that she tried desperately to find a husband, a home in a nice suburban area, and finally, happiness. This search for the perfect life led Short to start cavorting with some of the seedier men in Hollywood. Short started seeing a man named Mark Hansen, a rich and powerful Hollywood figure at the time. Hansen was the proprietor of a dozen movie theaters and was the part owner of the Florentine Gardens on Hollywood Boulevard. Hansen also operated a secret gambling casino behind Florentine Gardens. Shady, to say the least. One contemporary stated that Hansen worked in a shadowy hinterland between legitimate business and the fringes of the LA underworld. The sleaze with which Hansen operated had to do with grooming young girls for either prostitution or exotic dancing. At the Florentine Gardens, he kept an active harem of girls for either his delight or men he tried to impress. When Hansen approached Elizabeth Short, he courted her for 10 days, and tired of her repeated insistence that she was a virgin and her endless stream of boyfriends, Hansen gave up. Hansen then went his own way after seeing he could not crack the young girl's exterior. Over 500 people confessed to the murder, and investigators searched every nook and cranny in Short's life to determine who may have wanted the young girl dead. Although the authorities lacked any shortage of suspects, some of them were spotlighted due to their previous behaviors. One of these, folk singer Woody Guthrie, was once indicted in New York for sending obscene letters to young ladies. Guthrie became a suspect because of the hysteria that radiated from the case and because of the murder's sensationalism. But investigators discovered that he was nowhere near Los Angeles at the time of the murder. Most leads proved dead ends until late 1948. Dr. Joseph Paul DeRiver, a psychiatrist employed through the Los Angeles Police Department, coaxed the killer out of hiding, and the someone claiming to be Short's murder, a rather convincing suspect, wrote Dr. DeRiver a letter. The psychiatrist planted an article in a pulp crime magazine, True Detective, in order to lure the killer to the surface. Dr. DeRiver's stated methodology followed: a deep-seated compulsion to publicize and claim recognition for his act. In October 1948, a letter arrived for Dr. DeRiver at the LAPD Central Headquarters with a return address in Miami Beach, Florida. A person named Jack Sand signed the letter and stated that he was associated with the person who fitted the pattern of the infamous one. Jack Sand stated that he had been associated with the killer for 2 months while in San Francisco, and the man had the motive for the killing and knew the characters involved. Sand also volunteered his services in order to apprehend the killer. The LAPD set up meetings between Dr. DeRiver and Sand in Las Vegas, but logistical problems interfered with the two men meeting there. 2 police officers were assigned to Dr. DeRiver and acted as his driver and bodyguard during the whole incident to draw Sand out for his assistance. The true identity of Jack Sand was actually Leslie Dillon, an errand boy for Mark Hansen. Allegedly, when Hansen became tired of Short's demands for money and her boyfriend's, he enlisted Dillon to get rid of her. Dillon had been characterized as a dangerous and murderous psychopath. What interested police about Dillon that made him a prime suspect for the murder is that he knew 2 things about Short's demise that were never revealed to the public: the rose tattoo on Short's thigh that had been excised by the killer and placed with her female parts, and the cutting of her pubic hair where they were placed inside of her rectum. Moreover, Dillon worked briefly in a mortuary and became familiar with how to make the cut on the leg of a corpse to cause the bleeding out of the blood volume. Dillon also named another man who could be a suspect, a man named Jeff Connors. Dillon suggested to Dr. DeRiver that the killer bisected the body in order to determine how his sex organ would reach into Short's lower body. Dillon also hinted that the crime had been committed in a hotel, a ground-level hotel, so that the murderer could get the body outside without carrying it downstairs. Later documentation proved that a cabin at the Astor Motel in Los Angeles contained nothing but gore from the bed to the bathroom. The hotel manager, a man named Henry Hoffman, discovered some bloody women's clothing, and instead of reporting the incident, he investigated the hotel room and cleaned it for himself. It turns out that Hoffman had been arrested a few days earlier on a domestic relations disturbance and did not want any further difficulties with the police. There existed some reports that Hoffman had been seen with Short prior to her murder, but these reports remained unsubstantiated. Later, the owners admitted that they did discover a room at the hotel that was covered in the gore described much later in time. So, the assumption that Elizabeth Short's murder took place at a different location than that of where the body had been dumped held more credence with this discovery. Dr. DeRiver then requested that Dillon remove his shirt. The psychiatrist noted that Dillon had a very muscular physique. When asked to drop his pants in order to view Dillon's manhood, the informant at first hesitated, and then when he removed his trousers, Dr. DeRiver noted that Dillon possessed the penis of an 8-year-old boy. One of the letters that Dillon wrote to Dr. DeRiver made the point that the murderer had been mocked by Short, and she threatened exposure to his friends regarding his lack of manhood. The psychiatrist knew he had his man, yet the investigation suffered from another peripheral case that changed the course of discovering the real murderer of Elizabeth Short in the summer of 1949. At this time, the LAPD was proven to be rotten to the core, and a failed effort to eliminate the corruption was underway at the time. All of this as the police looked for a stone-cold killer. Dillon stated that he would not make a statement and reveal the real name of the murderer unless they brought him in for questioning. If they arrested him, he promised to talk to the authorities as he knew where the bodies were buried. History never recorded any disposition as to Dillon after he made this offer to the police.
The hunt for Elizabeth Short's killer continued as police did not know where to turn. Several suspects had been interviewed, but each proved to meet with dead ends. But observers noted that the LAPD may have missed some clues as to the identity of the real murderer. They put constant pressure on those they questioned, and in those days we know what that meant. Police extracted confessions of suspects who were not even near the crime scene or in the same state where the murder occurred. Of the 500 individuals that police questioned, The following suspects really stood out in the minds of authorities and still continue to pose serious questions surrounding the death of Elizabeth Short to the present day.
Robert Manley was a hardware salesman that dated Short for a time. Some eyewitnesses placed him in Short's company just prior to her death. Manley had a history of mental instability, which made him very suspicious to authorities. Detectives later confirmed his alibi for January 14th and 15th, clearing him of any suspicion. Dr. Walter Bailey became familiar with Short's sister, Virginia. Many believed that Bailey had a degenerative brain disease that caused periodic bouts of homicidal ideation, even in the most docile human beings. Some historians have postulated that because Short may have been short on cash and moving around a lot at the time of her death, she may have contacted Dr. Bailey in an attempt to borrow some money. Dr. Bailey, as a matter of fact, specialized in liposuction, hysterectomies, and amputations. Short often received money from men by giving them some sort of sob story where she said her husband died in the war and left her destitute. Investigators theorized that Dr. Bailey may have seen through Short's lie and became enraged at a very bad time in his illness, and he punished her for her lying. Historians have a tendency to speculate when they attempt connections between historical events. One of the most bizarre and horrendous killers that left investigators and historians scratching their heads was the Cleveland Torso Killer, or the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. These murders occurred in the 1930s and baffled then Cleveland Director of Public Safety, Elliot Ness. It was the one case he could never solve. From 1934 to 1938, the Butcher of Kingsbury Run viciously murdered more than 12 people, often emasculating and or decapitating them before disposing of the bodies. Most of these victims worked in the sex industry at the time, and certain parts of their anatomy were never found. The victims were dismembered much like Elizabeth Short, and many believed that the killer resurfaced in Los Angeles as well as other American cities over the years. The Butcher of Kingsbury Run penned a letter where he stated that he moved to Los Angeles and buried some of the heads he took with him from Cleveland. Both the victims of the Butcher and Elizabeth Short appeared to have been tortured and exsanguinated prior to the disposal of the bodies. Additionally, both Short and the Cleveland victims had been washed before the bodies had been dumped. But Short was not decapitated like the other victims. Brush bristles had been found under her skin, and a butcher knife was alleged to have been the murder weapon in both the Kingsbury Run murders and the murder of Elizabeth Short. In late 1950, the LAPD received a long-distance telephone call from Oakland, California, where a young lady, obviously feeling guilty for a bad act, wanted to confess to the murder of Elizabeth Short. This young lady called the Oakland Tribune and stated she wanted to tell the whole story of her motive, means, and opportunity surrounding the crime. Christine Mary Reynolds, a 35-year-old mother of three, confessed to murdering Elizabeth Short, turning herself in to the Oakland Police Department, and they held her for questioning so that the LAPD could question her further. According to the LAPD memorandum on the telephone conversation, Reynolds stated that she murdered Short with a knife and then cut her up with that same knife. Reynolds admitted that she preferred the company of women over men and had several liaisons with female movie stars in Hollywood. Reynolds stated that the time she went to Hollywood, she and Short lived together, and then Short informed her that she met a man. Reynolds then became enraged and decided to murder Short. Investigators determined that Reynolds merely fantasized about different women and definitely did not murder Short. One of the most commonsensical allegations actually came from a former LAPD detective named Steve Hodel. Hodel first came to prominence when he accused his own father, Dr. George Hodel, of the Elizabeth Short murder. Hodel stated that he had been piecing together the case against his father for over 2 decades and had written about accusing his relation of the crime. Over the summer of 2018, more evidence appeared when Hodel came into the possession of a letter written by an informant named W. Glenn Martin. Martin's granddaughter, Sandy Nichols, discovered the letter in her house over the summer of 2018 and contacted Hodel. The former detective discovered some photographs in 1999 within his late father's belongings that portrayed a woman he believed bore a striking resemblance to Elizabeth Short. Hodel also discovered some handwritten letters to the Los Angeles Police Department from a man who claimed to be Short's murderer. The handwriting, after analysis, Hodel claims matches his father's handwriting. Steve Hodel also stated that the manner in which the mutilations took place to Elizabeth Short match a technique that his father would have learned in medical school, hemicorporectomy. This, in layman's terms, means that the body had been cut in half without the use of a bone saw. Rather, the murderer cut Short through the discs in her back. This procedure is consistent with the mutilations Short suffered. Hodel went through newspaper archives and witness interviews from the case, and even had to go through Freedom of Information Act requests in order to gain access to records that no one had seen for almost 70 years. Hodel also accessed the FBI files on the case. Since he was no longer a member of the LAPD, he could not gain access to the official department files. Hodel also searched the UCLA archives under his father's name and discovered a plethora of receipts regarding some renovations his father made to his childhood home. In that folder, Hodel discovered a receipt dated a couple of days before the murder for a large bag of concrete, the same brand of concrete found on Short's body. Investigators believe the murderer used the bag to transport her body. By the time Hodel assembled his research in order to compile his book, most of the investigators had already died. But he did reconstruct conversations these investigators had with third parties. While a Los Angeles Times columnist named Steve Lopez requested official police files about the case, he discovered a suspects list, and Dr. George Hodel was one of 6 prime suspects on that list. The police monitored Hodel's activities and even bugged his house in 1950. One of the conversations that took place, Dr. Hodel stated, "Realized there was nothing I could do. Put a pillow over her head and cover her with a blanket. Get a taxi. Expired 12:59. They thought there was something fishy. Anyway, they may have figured it out. Killed her. Supposing I did kill the Black Dahlia, they couldn't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary anymore because she's dead." Even though this revelation stood as strong evidence that his father was the murderer, Hodel continued to research his father. Hodel stated that he found dozens of other murders that matched the signature of the Black Dahlia and could implicate his father as the killer. Dr. George Hodel actually moved to South America, and a Black Dahlia-style murder occurred there that drew a great deal of attention in the 1960s. Steve Hodel stated that the reason why his father murdered Elizabeth Short was that he dated her at one time and was motivated by jealousy. Insanely motivated jealousy. Steve Hodel learned during a recent television program on an investigation into the old Hodel residence that his father had a secret soundproof room installed within the middle of the house. Additionally, Dr. Hodel had been charged with incest with one of his daughters in 1949. After he was acquitted, he left the country. Although speculation with some documentary evidence has emerged as to the real identity of Elizabeth Short's murderer, it will remain a mystery, much like Jack the Ripper and the Zodiac Killer. All of these mysteries tantalize those that have researched unsolved murders, but the victims still cry out for justice. Will it ever materialize?
Dr. George Hodel was known as a fixer amongst the Hollywood set. He performed pregnancy terminations for young starlets or powerful men trying to hide their extramarital affairs from their gold-digging wives. Additionally, his office was located not too far from a funeral home in downtown Los Angeles where he could practice his mutilation skills. The fact that Dr. Hodel made the suspect list and was not pursued further denotes his connections to either police officials or the political machinations of Hollywood. Along with other historical unsolved murders, the Black Dahlia case is one of the more interesting. It is hard to discern as to whether this interest has anything to do with the alleged cover-up, or rather it has to do with the horrendous nature of the crime. Hypotheses abound when it comes to this case, and it takes much more than just the armchair detective to provide a breakthrough. Even though there have been some historians who may have come close, this is one of those instances where a needed, authentic confession would help in making the case for one suspect or the other. Until next time.
This episode is one that was recorded a long time ago, and now it's been remixed to reflect historical accuracy. As the United States entered the war in Europe, the citizens of the country waved goodbye to sons, husbands, and loved ones on their way to the Western Front to, quote, fight for democracy, end quote. The life in the Big Easy of New Orleans seemed a welcome distraction from the war. But among the nighttime shadows of the city, a killer surfaced who demanded appeasement from the residents of that city. This killer proved dastardly, diabolical, sociopathic, and psychotic. He held the city hostage for over 18 months, but those who tried to catch him never realized that his crimes may have gone back more than 8 years before. The dark days of the Axman still generate a morbid fascination with the macabre and foment fear amongst the locals who first hear of the reign of terror of this serial killer for the first time. The world would continue to see the brutality of such attacks, and even worse, as the allure of serial murder would permeate the human psyche. The most popular historical acceptance of the beginning of the Axman occurred at approximately 4:30 a.m. on the morning of May 23, 1918. A low moaning sound roused Jacob Maggio from his sound sleep. When Jake arose from his bed, he awoke his other brother, Andrew, from a drunken stupor where he was celebrating being called into the service of his country. Jake and Andrew stumbled through the house located at 4901 Magnolia Street in Midtown New Orleans, and when they opened the door to the room that their brother Joseph shared with his wife Catherine, the two men shrieked in horror. Catherine and Joseph lay in a pool of blood on the bed. Catherine lay groaning with a large gash on the side of her head. Joseph, with the same wounds, lay dead. Jake and Andrew immediately called for the police and an ambulance to assist with Mrs. Maggio, but she later died of her wounds. Captain John Drum was the first watch commander to arrive on the scene and noticed that an empty strongbox lay opened on the floor. Captain Drum surmised that the Maggios had been victims of a robbery gone badly. Captain Drum also noticed that one of the bottom panels of the back door adjacent to the Maggios' bedroom had been chiseled out. Captain Drum further surmised that more witnesses should have come forward due to the loud banging it would have taken to loosen the panel to break into the house. Dr. Joseph O'Hara, the coroner for Orleans Parish, determined that the Maggios succumbed to, quote, external and internal hemorrhages of the head and brain, end quote. Additionally, it appeared that both victims suffered from their throats being cut with a razor. Later that day, two New Orleans detectives, Theodore Obitz and Harry Dodson, stumbled across a chalk message in the sidewalk near the murder scene. The cryptic writing stated, quote, Mrs. Maggio is going to sit up late tonight just like Miss Tony, end quote. The message did not appear to make sense to either of the gumshoes, but they copied down the exact wording anyway. Andrew and Jake Maggio were arrested and brought to the 7th District Police Station for questioning. Despite being hungover and barely coherent, Andrew Maggio withstood the incessant questioning from police after they discovered the razor used to slice the throats of Joseph and Catherine belonged to the slowly sobering Andrew. The police later released the two brothers, but a rumor circulated throughout the city that the mafia was involved in the Maggio murder. Subsequently, authorities learned that something more diabolical was afoot. On the morning of June 28, 1918, a baker by the name of John Zanka walked up to the door of Dorgenois and La Harpe Streets, where he was to make a delivery at the grocery store run by Louis Bessemer. When Zanka received no response from his knocking on the front door, he went to the side alley to try that entranceway. Zanka noticed in the dimly lit alley that one of the panels at the bottom of the door appeared missing. Zanka prepared to knock again when suddenly Louis Bessemer answered the door with blood running down his face from a gash in his head. Bessemer claimed that the, quote, Axman, end quote, had visited he and his mistress, Harriet Lowe, in the middle of the night and wounded her badly as well. When police arrived, they noticed a pool of blood, but no Harriet. She received her wounds at one spot and then dragged herself to the bedroom where she lay unconscious. In the bathroom, the police discovered a bloody axe leaning against one of the walls of the tub. Diluted blood and water stood at the bottom of the tub. On the following day, authorities chose to approach the Bessemer case with a slight difference from the Maggios. While looking for clues to the attack on Bessemer and Lowe, the police discovered letters Bessemer had written in German and Yiddish. Authorities deduced that Bessemer was a German spy and therefore asked for the assistance from federal authorities. The Bessemer attack proved to be a, quote, red herring, end quote, and had nothing to do with the Axeman whatsoever. Louis Bessemer even requested that he be allowed to investigate his own case. Mrs. Lowe recovered, and it turned out to be just a lover's quarrel that turned violent. Because detectives advocated that the Bessemer case had Axeman signatures, Police Superintendent Frank Mooney demoted 2 detectives. The city remained free from any nocturnal attacks, at least until August 5th. Mrs. Edward Schneider lay in her bed resting on that muggy August night. Her husband worked nights and left her alone with their 3 children while he performed his job duties. As she lay on the bed, 9 months pregnant, her 3 children slept in the next room. When she opened her eyes briefly, she noticed a dark figure standing over her. The figure then struck her with something in the face, knocking out 2 front teeth and rendering her unconscious. Once the police brought her to Charity Hospital, Mrs. Schneider regained consciousness and became hysterical, believing that she would lose her baby. The trauma of the attack caused her to go into labor. When the child was born, there were no effects from the attack, and both baby and mother recovered from the excitement. After an extensive search of the house, detectives discovered the axe missing from the family's tool shed. 5 days later, police were called to the residence of another grocer, Joseph Romano. When they arrived, the authorities found the lifeless and bloodied body of the grocer barber. The police found no evidence suggesting the identity of the perpetrator, but 2 witnesses, Pauline, aged 18, and her sister Mary, aged 13, lay in bed trying to sleep and heard nothing of the attack on their uncle. Pauline stated that she awoke at approximately 3 a.m. and saw what she thought to be the shadow of a tall man standing near her door. Just then, her uncle, Mr. Romano, stumbled into the girl's room and appeared to be dazed with blood running from a deep wound in the scalp. Romano then went into the next room and slumped into the chair where he stated, "Something has happened. My head hurts. Call for an ambulance." The Axeman had attacked 2 families and left 3 dead in his wake. Police tried desperately to determine what type of individual could have been responsible for the terror. Detective John D'Antonio, an experienced investigator who worked the Walter Lamanna murder case some 11 years before, sought to identify the characteristics of the killer in an interview to the local newspapers.
"I am convinced the man is of a dual personality, and it is very probable he is the man we tried so hard to get 10 years ago, when a series of axe and butcher knife murders was committed within a few months. My opinion is based on experience and a study of criminology. Criminals such as the ones like the Axman are on the order of Jack the Ripper, who some years ago terrorized London. They are cunning and hard to catch. I've never known the mafia to kill women. In fact, you could not get a mafia agent to murder a woman under any circumstances.
The attacks that Detective D'Antonio referenced occurred between 1910 and 1917. In the early morning hours of August 14, 1910, Mr. August Crudy and his wife settled in for the night in the apartment above their grocery store located at the corner of Lesseps and Royal Streets. Crudy often suffered from an upset stomach, and in the early morning hours of the 14th, Crudy awoke after laying down for approximately a half an hour. Crudy got out of bed and walked to the backyard of the residence in the hopes that the night air would relieve his discomfort. He returned to bed next to his wife and fell asleep at approximately 1 a.m. At approximately 3 a.m., Mrs. Crudy awoke to find a large dark figure standing next to her bed holding what appeared to be a meat cleaver. The figure demanded money, and Mrs. Crudy obliged the demand. When Mrs. Crudy asked for her husband, she then shook August, and when he turned over, bled from massive gashes in his head. When August tried to raise himself up from the bed, the assailant struck him again with the cleaver, and Mr. Crudy fell off the bed with the force of the blow. The attacker soon fled after the strike. Surprisingly, August Crudy recovered from his wounds, but never forgot the actions from that night. Police had no leads as to the mysterious assailant. 5 weeks later, on September 21, 1910, Mr. and Mrs. Joseph Rosetto, who owned a grocery store at the corner of London and Tonti Avenues, suffered a brutal attack by a mysterious stranger, and once authorities made it to the crime scene, they feared the Rosettos would not survive. Fortunately, the Rosettos did survive the attack and would later reunite in the hospital. Again, the police had no leads or suspects. For over a year, the city remained quiet regarding the phantom assailant. Then on September 21, 1911, Joseph Dobby and his wife were attacked while they slept in the small apartment they owned behind their grocery store at 2425 Galvez Street. The first blow struck Mr. Dobby over the head and fractured his skull. Mrs. Dobby received deep cuts on her nose and hands. Mr. Dobby succumbed to his wounds, and Mrs. Dobby stated that, quote, she would devote the balance of her life to find the murderer or murderers of her husband, end quote. Even averring to find the killers, Mrs. Dobby could not identify the assailant or assailants that killed her husband. The killer remained silent for 8 months, and then, on May 12, 1912, Corporal George Duffy of the 5th Precinct received a telephone call from a Fred Stegelmeyer who resided at 4212 Villeray Street. Stegelmeyer claimed to the young officer that he heard gunshots coming from a barroom owned by Anthony J. Chambra and his wife, Johanna, at the corner of France and Villeray Streets. Corporal Duffy proceeded to the Chambra residence, and when he opened the door to the residence behind the barroom, he found Anthony Chambra nude with gunshot wounds to the back. His wife, Johanna, lay unconscious from a gunshot wound to the hip. Corporal Duffy tried to question Miss Chambra when she could barely sustain consciousness, but she could not identify the assailant. Anthony Chambra died at the scene. Mrs. Chambra died from her wound a few days later. Almost 5 years later, on Saturday morning, December 22, 1917, Epitana Andolina and his 2 sons, John and Salvador, suffered from wounds they sustained during a hatchet attack at their residence and place of business at 8301 Apple Street. Mrs. Andolina first saw the intruder and gave the alarm with a loud scream, alerting the others to the presence of a stranger standing near the foot of her bed. The assailant struck Mr. Andolina in the head, and when his sons intervened, they received wounds as well. The intruder then escaped. No one could give a credible description of the assailant. When D'Antonio reminded the populace of the city of the previous murders and attacks, Superintendent of Police Frank Mooney began in earnest to find the killer. He studied the previous cases and noticed that the killings escalated in the ferocity. With no other leads to follow, the police had nothing to do but wait until another attack occurred. This would never be more certain. In an effort to allay the fears of the residents of New Orleans, on August 19, 1918, a local supermarket used the murders to advertise specials at their store. Although indeed in bad taste, the newspaper advertisement displayed the morbid sense of humor used as a coping mechanism by the citizens of the city. The new year passed without much fanfare, but on March 9, 1919, the Axman struck again. On the west bank of the Mississippi River is the small hamlet known as Gretna. Charles Cortimiglia normally opened his grocery store at the corner of Jefferson and 2nd Streets early in the morning. Hazel Jackson, a neighbor of the Cortimiglia family, tried to get someone to answer the door, but to no avail. Jackson then went to the side alley and knocked on the door there. Jackson noticed that a chair was under the bedroom window where Mr. and Mrs. Cortimiglia slept. Jackson also noticed that the back door had one of its panels missing. She ran from the house and then immediately notified the police. When authorities arrived at the Cortimiglia residence, they found the lifeless body of 2-year-old Mary Cortimiglia. Mr. and Mrs. Cortimiglia had been attacked after their little girl, but they clung to life. Mrs. Cortimiglia cried uncontrollably for her deceased child. When police located the bloody axe used on the Cortimiglias under the front steps of their house, little clumps of hair and brain were discovered on the blade. While in the hospital, Mrs. Cortimiglia identified 17-year-old neighbor Orlando Gugliardo Jr. as her assailant. Gugliardo's father, Orlando Gugliardo Sr., was also identified as an accomplice. Mrs. Cortimiglia used to work for Mr. Gugliardo and left his employ to start a business of her own across the street. Mrs. Cortimiglia convinced her husband to start another business in order to put the Gugliardos out of business. Subsequently, the two men stood trial and were found guilty. But later, Mrs. Cortimiglia had an epiphany and decided to tell the truth about the Gugliardos, recanting her accusations against the father and the son. They were immediately released and the charges against them dropped. Superintendent Mooney gave a candid interview to the local media where he expressed his beliefs as to the character of the murderer. As these axe murders have grown in number, I've been forced to the belief that they are the work of a madman. I am convinced that the murders are the work of an axe-wielding degenerate who has no robbery motive, but who has taken small sums to throw the police off the track. I further believe he is a sadist, and he crawls through the panel of the door. After going into the house, he opens the door. To add further mystique to the identity of the killer, on March 16, 1919, the local newspaper, the Times-Picayune, received a cryptic letter that appeared to taunt the police. The letter read in its entirety:
Hell, March 13th, 1919. Esteemed mortal of New Orleans, they have never caught me and they never will. They have never seen me, for I am invisible, even as the ether that surrounds your earth. I am not a human being, but a spirit and a demon from the hottest hell. I am what you Orleanians and your foolish police call the Axman of Notre Dame. When I see fit, I shall come and claim other victims. I alone know who they'll be. I shall leave no clue except my bloody axe be smeared with blood and brains of he whom I have sent below to keep me company. If you wish, you may tell the police to be careful and not to rustle my jimmies. Of course, I am a reasonable spirit. I take no offense at the way they have conducted their investigations in the past. In fact, they have been so utterly stupid as to not only amuse me, but His Satanic Majesty, Franz Joseph, etc. But tell them to beware. Let them not try to discover what I am, for it were better that they were never born than to incur the wrath of the great Axeman. I don't think there is any need of such a warning, for I feel sure the police will always dodge me, as they have in the past. They are wise and know how to keep away from all harm. Undoubtedly, you Orleanians think of me as a most horrible murderer, which I am. But I could be much worse if I wanted to. Trust me, bucko. If I wished, I could pay a visit to your city every night. At will, I could slay thousands of your best citizens, and the worst, for I am in close relationship with the Angel of Death herself. Now, to be exact, at 12:15 earthly time, on next Tuesday night, I'm going to pass over New Orleans. In my infinite mercy, I'm going to make a little proposition to you people. Here it is. I'm very fond of jazz music, and I swear by all the devils in my nether regions that every person shall be spared in whose home a jazz band is in full swing at the time I have just mentioned. If everyone has a jazz band going, well, then, so much the better for you people. One thing is certain, that is that some of your people who do not jazz it out on that specific Tuesday night, if there be any, will get the axe. My axe. Well, as I am cold and crave the warmth of my native Tartarus, and it is about time I leave your earthly home, I will cease my discourse. Hoping that thou wilt publish this, that it may go well with thee, I have been, am, and will be the worst spirit that ever existed, either in fact or the realm of fantasy. Deuces, the Axman.
Examination of the note in present-day terms would most certainly have been discounted. Although serial killers seek to inject themselves into the investigation and draw attention to their outwitting of the police, this letter gave no details of the crimes which only the killer could have been aware. Secondly, it would appear that the supernatural being referring to himself as, quote, the Axman, end quote, is following in the footsteps of a bloody mentor, Jack the Ripper. The former not only wrote letters to the press about his crimes and taunted the police, but also allegedly left a mysterious message after his fourth murder that, even to this day, historians argue as to its meaning. This leaves the Mrs. Tony message scrawled on the sidewalk not too far from the Maggio murder scene, to leave investigators and historians alike to ponder the demented ramblings of a psychopath. In demanding that the city's inhabitants fill the air with jazz music on the night of the killer's choosing, a city gripped in fear hoped to appease the murderer. A further effort to make sure that the killer would pass over the residents playing his favorite music, John Joseph Davila wrote a special ditty entitled The Mysterious Axeman's Jazz, or Papa Don't Scare Me. Other musicians reviewed the piece with comical criticism as the playful piece was composed during the bloody aspects of the crimes being committed. Exactly as the Axeman demanded, every home played jazz music on March 19, 1919, in the hopes that the demon would not visit their home that night. The Times-Picayune printed a cartoon lampooning the night of jazz. While the family sat around the piano and made merry, a young mother can be seen at the window casting watch over her family. The danger was real, and the people of New Orleans took the threat with the phantom seriously. The city experienced a temporary reprieve from the murders. That reprieve only lasted until the end of the summer that year. On August 3, 1919, Sarah Lauman, a young, vivacious 19-year-old girl, felt a paralyzing boom on her head as she slept. When she awoke, she suffered a gaping wound in her head and managed to scare off her intruder. The assailant attempted to make his way into the Lauman residence through a window and not through a panel in the door. Miss Lauman recovered from her wounds. At approximately 1:45 a.m. on October 27, 1919, the Axeman claimed his alleged last victim. Jefferson Parish Deputy Ben Corcoran was walking home after a long shift at the station when 11-year-old Rosie Pepitone ran into the middle of the street and began screaming that her father had been attacked. Deputy Corcoran asked the little girl to show him where she lived, and when the two arrived at the Pepitone residence, Deputy Corcoran spoke with Esther Pepitone, the victim's wife. Mrs. Pepitone went into the bedroom, followed by the deputy. Corcoran examined Mike Pepitone as he lay on the bed bleeding profusely from a gaping wound in his head. Mrs. Pepitone then said to the police officer, quote, "It looks like the Axeman was here and murdered Mike," end quote. An ambulance soon arrived and rushed the bleeding man to the charity hospital. Mike Pepitone later succumbed to his wounds. Instead of the assailant using an axe, this time he used an iron bar with a bolt at the end of it. Other than the utterances of his wife, the police could find no connection between the Pepitone attack and that of the Axeman's previous victims. After an intense investigation, police surmised that the attack on Mike Pepitone may have been a revenge killing stemming from his father's association with organized crime a few years earlier.
In 1910, Mike's father, Pietro Pepitone, shot and killed a rival grocer by the name of Charles Di Cristina. The elder Pepitone stood trial and was convicted of murder and sentenced to 20 years in prison. Peter Pepitone later received a pardon and released from Angola State Penitentiary. It may have been a revenge killing for the death of Di Cristina, but why wait 10 years to carry out a vendetta? After the attack on the Pepitones, the city of New Orleans breathed a sigh of relief and almost forgot the horrors brought on to the population by the killer. That is until a newspaper article appeared stating that the mystery of the Axman had been solved. In 1921, newspaper headlines from Los Angeles, California stated that a Mrs. Esther Albano had shot a man by the name of Joseph Mumphrey, who had entered her home uninvited. Mrs. Albano declared that the man demanded money from her and threatened both her and her children if the money were not forthcoming. Police later identified Mrs. Albano as Mrs. Mike Pepitone, the wife of the last alleged victim of the Axman, Mike Pepitone. After the death of her husband, Mrs. Pepitone traveled to California to attend her niece's wedding. While there, she met a man named Angelo Albano, whom she married a short time later. On October 27, 1921, Esther Albano reported her husband missing. Alerted relatives in New Orleans traveled to Los Angeles to help with the search. Allegedly, the man calling himself Joseph Mumphrey repeatedly threatened to kill Angelo Albano if some money were not paid. On one particular night, Mumphrey visited the Albano residence and demanded the money. When he leveled threats to Mrs. Albano, she did what she had to do to protect her family. After her arrest and subsequent trial, Esther Albano was acquitted of all charges. In all, the Axman claimed 8 victims, injuring somewhere between 6 and 10 people. Joseph Mumphrey has been forwarded as the main suspect in this case, but prison records from that time period reflect that Mumphrey had been in prison since 1908 and did not secure his release until 1923. So, who was the Axman? Again, we may never know unless there is an eyewitness account that we have never heard of, or a police report where the detectives made some sort of assumption. Still, it does send chills down your spine when you realize this man, if he was a man, was never apprehended.
William Shakespeare, the pearl of English literature, wrote in Othello, quote, "O beware, my lord, of jealousy. It is the green-eyed monster, which doth mock the meat it feeds on." End quote. Jealousy causes human behavior to morph into abnormal behavior. Take, for instance, the case we are profiling in this episode. A perceived virginal young woman portrayed as the victim of a diabolical seduction, a spoiled, rich young man who sees in the young girl the love of his life and will go to the far ends of the earth of being known as her protector, and an older man accused of playing the part of the rich, powerful, popular seducer. It is truly a tragic case that was driven through the press and demonstrated the undeniable power of money and influence.
On June 28, 1906, at approximately 8 a.m., mourners arrived at a large prominent house located on 21st Street, facing Gramercy Park in New York City. Once mourners arrived, they paid their respects to the prominent man lying in the casket of the parlor of the residence. When the multitudes of people concluded their mourning, a hearse and 4 carriages drew up before the house, and the close relatives and friends mounted the carriages for the journey to his interment. A funeral mass was said at the Little Episcopal Church at St. James, Long Island. After the burial, the mourners dispersed. As the causes of his death remained a mystery, some still had questions in their minds as to why this venerated artist had to die, to be dispatched in public in front of many witnesses. After all, the deceased contributed greatly to the metropolitan landscape of New York City. In fact, he designed the original Madison Square Garden that contained a theater and restaurant on the top floor where influential New Yorkers attended performances and hobnobbed with their class. The murder of Stanford White
architect and humanitarian, raised questions as to the equitable nature of the justice system. But his demise also opened the door to a dark world of perversion, seduction, and period deviance. The central figure in White's death set her sights on becoming an actress and made her way to New York City at the age of 15 in December of 1900. She began as a model in Pennsylvania, where her career seemed to spell bigger and better things. Within a few days of arriving in the city, a renowned local artist, James Carroll Beckwith, saw the young girl and determined that she fit the mold of the, quote, perfectly formed nymph, end quote, and requested that she pose for him twice a week in order for the artist to complete a portrait of the young girl. Soon after posing for Beckwith, the young girl, Evelyn Nesbit, saw her services in great demand as she soon appeared on the covers of postcards and magazines. Nesbit even appeared on Cosmopolitan, Vanity Fair, Harper's Bazaar, and Ladies' Home Journal. Most historians of the period branded Evelyn as the first pin-up girl of the 20th century. Although she had no formal training as an actress, Nesbit won a role in the musical of Florodora in 1901. At one of these performances of the risque musical, Evelyn caught the eye of one of the most influential men in New York City at the time, Stanford White. White acted like a smitten teenager whenever he attended a performance in which Evelyn appeared. What the rest of New York did not know is that White exhibited an almost insatiable appetite for young girls and indiscriminate intercourse with those young girls. White, along with other men his age at the time, formed an organization in 1887 known as the, quote, Sewer Club, end quote, where they brought young women, and sometimes young boys, to a secluded, out-of-the-way place within the city to indulge in their fantasies of whatever suited their fancy. A man as powerful and wealthy as White attracted the most beautiful young girls and boys to the lair of decadence. White's infatuation with Evelyn grew steadily, and the 46-year-old White arranged with another chorus girl who was quite intimate with Evelyn to have the stunning teenager attend a, quote, society luncheon, end quote. It turned out the luncheon to be just a lunch with 4 people held at White's West 24th Street apartment. It was there, after the luncheon, that White introduced Evelyn to the, quote, red velvet swing, end quote, a seemingly harmless device hanging from the ceiling of White's second floor of the apartment. After several prodding suggestions from the middle-aged architect to Evelyn to try the swing, she relented. Over the course of several months, White gained the confidence of Evelyn's mother so that the young girl spent more time with him. When Evelyn first met White, she considered him, quote, terribly old, end quote, but then grew to admire his charming demeanor and what can only be described as his, quote, boundless playfulness. Mrs. Nesbit believed White to be harmless and only wanted to cultivate a paternal relationship with her daughter. Over time, though, Mrs. Nesbit allowed her teenage daughter to attend numerous parties and luncheons where White was the host. White softened the mother with lavish gifts and began calling him, quote, Stanny, end quote, mentioning him to her friends that White became their, quote, benefactor, end quote. Approximately 2 months after solidifying his friendship with Evelyn's mother, White offered to pay all expenses for Mrs. Nesbit to take a trip to her home in Pittsburgh. Evelyn's mother stated she would make the trip on the condition that Evelyn saw no one but White during her absence. While Mrs. Nesbit traveled to Pittsburgh, White sent a cab for Evelyn at the residence where she stayed. Told there would be a cocktail party, when Evelyn arrived at White's apartment, she noticed no other guests there but her. White explained all the other guests declined to attend and they would have to make do with just them two. According to the later account Evelyn rendered, she drank a lot of champagne and passed out. When she awoke, Evelyn laid nude in a bed covered by silk sheets with a canopied mirror. The telltale sign of her deflowering appeared on her inner thigh. White was reported to have given Evelyn a kimono and told her, quote, "Don't cry, kittens. It's all over. Now you belong to me," end quote. For several days after that, Evelyn bounced between anger and confusion, as she could not decipher how a man she respected and admired could have done this to her. In any case, with no other suitors or men willing to take care of her, she stayed with White for some time, and any further appearances on the red velvet swing would entail Evelyn's nudity. White showered the young girl with expensive gifts such as pearl necklaces, 3 diamond rings, and a set of fox furs. In August of 1902, Evelyn met a young sketch artist at one of the lavish parties thrown by White. The artist, John Barrymore, the future celebrated actor, waited until White left New York City for a fishing trip in Canada. Since the architect would be out of town for 2 weeks, Barrymore made his move for Evelyn. When Mrs. Nesbit found out about the budding relationship between her daughter and Barrymore, she notified White almost immediately and implored him to intervene to end the relationship. When White intervened, Evelyn faced animus from 2 different directions and reluctantly agreed to attend a boarding school in New Jersey. After Florodora ran its course, Evelyn won a part in another musical, Wild Irish Rose. After one of her performances in that work, Evelyn received flowers, letters, and offers of large gifts from a man calling himself, quote, Mr. Monroe, end quote. Monroe asked Evelyn to accompany him to dinners and other parties, but she politely declined his advances. The man calling himself Mr. Monroe was, in fact, Harry K. Thaw, the millionaire playboy from Pittsburgh. Thaw sought Evelyn's affections due to his infatuation with the young girl, and also that he hated Stanford White, and the affair between Evelyn and White became public knowledge. Thaw considered White to be a, quote, ravisher of young girls, end quote, and White kept Thaw from joining various clubs in the city. Additionally, Thaw desired more than anything to become Evelyn's, quote, knight in shining armor, end quote, to protect her from the brutish White. Thaw finally arranged a meeting with Evelyn through an intermediary, and according to Evelyn's later accounts, once Thaw finally got his wish, he knelt before Evelyn, kissed the hem of her dress, and stated that Evelyn was the most beautiful girl in the city of New York. Thaw finally revealed that he came from a very wealthy family, but Evelyn sensed something strange with the young man who strived to be her suitor. Thaw pursued Evelyn with a reckless abandon. In 1903, at the end of the term for her boarding school, Evelyn developed appendicitis and needed life-saving surgery. Thaw rushed the young girl to the hospital and held her hand while she was there, professing his love for Evelyn. When she recovered, Evelyn reluctantly agreed to go to Europe with Thaw and his mother, a trip that Evelyn later regretted. In a Paris hotel room, at Thaw's urging after he plied her with a lot of champagne, Evelyn related what White did to her. When Thaw listened to every gory and sordid detail, he, according to Evelyn, quote, shuddered, whimpered, and then went limp, end quote. Thaw kept whispering, quote, oh God, poor child, end quote. Harry K. Thaw was the type of personality that could not let bygones be bygones, and the memory of the woman he now loved being ravaged by an older man who stifled the young man's social standing festered within the young millionaire's mind. Subsequent to Mrs. Thaw leaving the couple in Europe and returning to the United States, Thaw and Evelyn found themselves in a rented castle in Austria. Evelyn described the castle in her memoirs as
a huge Gothic nightmare of cold stones and dimly lit, drafty passageways, grimmer than anything in the Grimm brothers' tales. Evelyn Nesbit.
On the first night in the castle, Evelyn fell asleep and was awakened by a naked and seething Thaw. He threw aside the covers and began abusing her with a riding crop. Eventually, Thaw forced Evelyn into a sexual encounter. In the eyes of those who knew the truth, Thaw's behavior mirrored that of White's in this instance. Although Thaw saw himself as Evelyn's sole protector, both men viewed the young girl as a possession to be owned. After this incident, and upon their return to the United States, on April 5, 1906, Evelyn and Harry Thaw were married in a private ceremony in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Evelyn then moved into the Thaw mansion, which could only be described as, quote, large and depressing, end quote, in Pittsburgh. What can only be a bird in a gilded cage, Evelyn lived a life of restricted luxury, resembling a sex slave with no escape. In the spring of 1906, Thaw started arrangements to schedule a European trip for he and Evelyn, and planned to spend a week in New York prior to heading across the Atlantic. The ship was set to sail on June 28th. On June 25, 1906, At approximately 6 p.m., Evelyn left her hotel suite on Fifth Avenue and met her husband at a local bar where they had drinks. Thaw had been there for quite some time and already consumed 3 alcoholic beverages. Thaw paid the $3 tab with a $100 bill, and then the couple headed off to Cafe Martin. As the Thaws enjoyed their dinner, Stanford White walked in with his son. Evelyn stated that a cold chill ran down her spine as he walked past the table. Considering the city heat, true fear embraced the young girl. Harry Thaw did not notice White's presence. Evelyn wrote a small note to Thaw informing him of White's presence. Thaw uncharacteristically did not lose his temper at first. As the couple left the restaurant and Thaw put on a straw hat, he cracked the brim in anger. Thaw then announced that he had tickets to a performance of Mam'zelle Champagne at the dinner theater atop Madison Square Garden later that evening. During the performance, Thaw learned that White would be there for the play. Later witnesses remembered once Thaw learned that his nemesis would be there, he, quote, paced the theater's lobby like a caged tiger, end quote. Evelyn realized what would happen if a confrontation ensued between Thaw and White, and very politely asked Thaw if they could leave. Evelyn and Thaw were part of a group of 4 people, and when they got to the elevator before leaving, 3 of them noticed Thaw had slipped away. The next thing the party knew, gunshots rang out. Evelyn knew immediately what happened. Thaw slipped away from his party as they were leaving and made his way to White's table, some 5 rows away from the stage. Thaw produced a revolver and confronted White. From 12 feet away, Thaw fired the first shot, which hit White in the head, killing him instantly. Thaw drew closer to White and fired the last 2 shots from approximately 2 to 3 feet away, striking White again in the head and the left shoulder. Once Thaw fired the last shot, he uttered,
"I did it because he ruined my wife. He had it coming to him. He took advantage of her and deserted her."
After the shooting and Thaw's proclamation, chaos ensued throughout the theater where herds of people made their way to the exits. The stage manager yelled that the show should continue and ordered the band to continue playing. At the moment of the shooting, Evelyn knew her husband had done something horrific. Police officers summoned very quickly arrested Thaw immediately. As they led the murderer away, Evelyn stated to her husband, quote, "Look at the fix you are in," end quote. Thaw replied, quote, "It's all right, dear. I have probably saved your life," end quote. On June 26, 1906, at approximately 3 a.m., authorities charged Harry K. Thaw with the murder of Stanford White and escorted him from the station house across the Bridge of Sighs to the Tombs, the city prison of New York City. In formulating a strategy to prosecute Thaw, New York District Attorney William T. Jerome, the combative prosecutor, sought to have Thaw deemed insane and sent to an asylum to save the state of New York some money. Thaw's original attorney, Louis Delfield, thought this to be a great idea. Why would a sane man literally execute the alleged abuser of his wife in front of 1,000 witnesses? Thaw would not even consider it and labeled Delfield a traitor. Thaw fired his attorney and hired another attorney. Thaw hoped to be put on the stand at trial and expose what he called, quote, "that set of perverts," end quote. In late January of 1907, jury selection began, and on February 4, 1907, opening statements began in the case of the State of New York versus Harry Kendall Thaw. At the start of the trial, Thaw realized that if he did not plead insanity, he could seriously face the electric chair in the murder of Stanford White. On February 7, 1907, Evelyn Nesbit Thaw took the stand and related the horrible events that transpired after she met Stanford White. On the stand, Evelyn stated,
"He made me swear that I would never tell my mother about it. He said there was no use in talking, and the greatest thing in the world was not to get found out."
Evelyn responded when asked if Thaw got agitated when she related the details of what transpired between her and White.
"Yes, he was excited and walked up and down the room. We sat up all night. He said it was not my fault, that no one could blame me, and that I was only an unfortunate girl, and that he didn't think any less of me. He would marry me anyway."
The defense wanted to admit a letter that Evelyn wrote to Thaw explaining the incidents that occurred between her and White. D.A. Jerome objected, but by the afternoon session, the letter was admitted into evidence, thus substantiating Evelyn's testimony in front of the court. Evelyn also stipulated that White tried to poison her against Thaw and keep her from Thaw's advances. By the middle of February, the gallery heard the grotesque story of a man who made advances and took advantage of a young girl half his age. The defense invoked a supplemental defense to Thaw's actions, entailing an uncodified law known as the, quote, unwritten law, end quote. The unwritten law applied predominantly to women who were wronged by their paramours. At the turn of the 20th century, the law was used as a defense of many women who murdered their paramours. If it worked for the women, the defense argued, it can work for Harry K. Thaw. But theoretically, the law only applied when in infidelity situations and not just the smoldering jealousy of a man proven to be abusive as well. During the course of the Thaw trial, the defense demonized the victim, Stanford White, in an attempt to win an acquittal for their client. Finally, in April of 1907, D.M. Delmas, defense attorney for Thaw, made a 2.5-hour closing statement to the case. Delmas appealed to chivalry when he stated,
"The man who had brooded on this subject for 3 years, who had pictures of dreadful horrors haunting him by day and in the stillness of the night, could not be human to retain the calmness of reason."
Delmas concluded by asking the jurors to put themselves in Thaw's place. Would they have not defended the honor of the woman they loved in such a way? Later in the day of April 12, 1907, the jury deliberated but could not reach a verdict in the case of the State of New York versus Harry K. Thaw. With the announcement of the verdict, Harry Thaw appeared unaffected. Police escorts brought the defendant back to the Tombs, and D.A. Jerome, determined to see Thaw prosecuted, vowed that another trial for the murder of Stanford White would be forthcoming. The second trial occurred in the mid to latter part of January 1908. Thaw's defense attorneys claimed Thaw insane when he committed the murder, diminished capacity. After 25 hours after being given their charges, the jury found Thaw not guilty by diminished capacity. Thaw would later be sentenced to the Mattawan Asylum for the Criminally Insane and would remain there until judged appropriate to return to society. Although Thaw escaped any real justice, the stigma of murderer did not necessarily stain his reputation any. Most believe that Evelyn's testimony at the second trial proved vindicating to her husband. In fact, later in her life, Evelyn admitted that her mother-in-law, Mrs. Thaw, offered Evelyn a divorce and $1 million if she testified at the second trial that Stanford White raped her. Evelyn eventually got her divorce, but the $1 million never materialized. Thaw stayed at the Mattawan until 1913, when another court determined him sane. Upon his release, Thaw went to Canada, but authorities extradited him back to the United States. Another sanity trial found him sane in 1915. Thaw's life continued without much incident until 1916. Thaw invited a young boy by the name of Frederick G. Gump Jr. to New York to act as Thaw's protege. The young man traveled from Kansas City, Missouri to New York in order to take the opportunity. A period newspaper described the young man as, quote, "He was physically a perfect specimen of strong young manhood," end quote. Gump's description of the harrowing incident incited many regarding the cruelty Thaw exhibited toward the young man. Once Thaw locked the boy in a suite at the McAlpin Hotel in New York City, Thaw began the evening with some small conversation that seemed to impress Gump. Gump then retired to take a bath. Thaw peeked into the bathroom twice while the young man bathed. On the third time, Gump stood up in the tub and Thaw grabbed the boy's hand and yanked him into the hotel room. Thaw beat the young man with a series of whips, and Gump fought him for over an hour to get the older man to stop. As the boy struggled, Thaw continued to beat the boy. When Gump lost the strength to resist Thaw's beating, Gump begged Thaw to stop. Thaw then replied, quote, "Not until you are my slave," end quote. The subsequent rendition of the events of what happened sickened many people. Eventually, after a horrific night of abuse, Gump escaped the hotel room. A later physical examination of the young boy revealed the extent of the abuse. At the trial for this offense, the jury found Thaw insane and sentenced him, again, to an insane asylum. Authorities released Thaw after he spent 7 years in the facility. He died in 1947 from a heart attack and is buried in the Allegheny Cemetery of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Evelyn Nesbit later went on to marry a dance instructor, Jack Clifford, who left her in 1918 but did not divorce her until 1933. Later in Evelyn's life, approximately 6 years after the second trial, Evelyn sought spousal support for her 6-year-old son that she claimed Thaw as the father. What she didn't rely on was that someone came forward and claimed paternity at the time. Therefore, any claim that Evelyn may have had on the Thaw fortune dried up with the father's admission. In 1955, Hollywood made a movie about Evelyn entitled The Girl in the Red Velvet Swing. The producers took a great deal of license to produce a viewership. Joan Collins played the lead role, with Farley Granger as Thaw and Ray Milland as the older Stanford White. Evelyn Nesbit died in a nursing home in Santa Monica, California on January 17, 1967, at the age of 82.
No one at the time of the trials believed that Harry K. Thaw would do any real time for the murder of Stanford White. Did Evelyn Nesbit drive Harry K. Thaw, a millionaire playboy, mama's boy, to murder someone who shamed her and her mother? It is blatantly obvious that Thaw was an unstable man who could not let go of the past. Granted, White may have been portrayed as what we term, quote, a dirty old man, end quote. But did he deserve to be murdered in the manner that Thaw chose? Was Thaw's anger more because White may have been a more successful man in an upper-crust society that Thaw strived to join? The Thaw family was wealthy beyond anyone's imagination at the time. Certainly, money was not the object, but reputation was. Or was it merely just plain old murderous jealousy? Until next time. If you were born between 1946 and 1964, you will remember the terror that our generation experienced as we were constantly warned against a nuclear holocaust and the dangers of communism. As a society, we were totally devoid of any knowledge of the lives of the people behind the Iron Curtain of the Eastern Bloc. Only those stories that the Politburo released to the public, and of the stories of those who had already defected to the West. What we did know was that long lines existed for food, housing, and the basic necessities we took for granted were considered luxuries in the countries in the shadow of the Soviet sphere. All that came to an end with the crumbling of the Berlin Wall and the fall of communism and Marxism in 1989. But what we also discovered was that the Soviet Union experienced the same problems as the ones that we experienced in the West. And one more specifically, serial killers.
In the late afternoon, early evening of December 22nd, 1978, Svetlana Grenakova waited for a streetcar in the town of Shakti, Russia, to take her home. The day was very cold, and Svetlana looked for a distraction from the frigid weather. She noticed a short, plump girl standing just a short distance from her. The young girl, who Svetlana believed was only 10 years old, wore a red coat with her hood trimmed with black fur. Svetlana also noticed that the young girl also wore a woolen scarf and a brown rabbit fur cap. Svetlana took great care in noticing the young girl. Then her attention focused more on the man standing next to her. Svetlana noticed a tall man, gray-haired, in his 40s, wearing glasses and a long black overcoat and carrying a shopping bag. The young girl standing next to the middle-aged man did not appear to be with him, but paid attention to what he said to her in conversation. Svetlana then noticed the man walk away from the plump girl, and then she followed him, looking happy and content. As Svetlana's streetcar arrived, she watched them walk away and then lost sight of them. The young girl that Svetlana observed was 9-year-old Lena Zakatnova. From all descriptions, Lena was a vibrant, cheerful little girl who had been telling her friends that she met a man that was bringing her some imported chewing gum. The ruse of chewing gum worked, as the young girl walked with the older man to a secret house. When Lena and the middle-aged man reached the secret house, not really a house but a small shack, the man unlocked the door to the shanty, switched on the light, and led Lena into the shack. Instantaneous to her entry, the man shoved Lena to the floor and tore out her clothes, removing her coat and her panties. When the girl began to scream, the man shoved his forearm into her throat to muffle the sound of her screams. The middle-aged man exerted his whole body weight upon Lena's throat until her plump body went limp. Unconscious on the floor of the shack, with her eyes remaining open, this facet made the man feel very bizarre, so he used a scarf to cover her eyes. He began to defile her body, but appeared unable to achieve an erection and violated the private parts of the young girl's body. The middle-aged man believed that the vicious attack on a small child brought him to orgasm like nothing before. As he continued to fondle part of her body, Lena awoke from her unconsciousness, drawing breath through her damaged throat. Panicking that the young girl may identify him to authorities, the middle-aged man produced a knife from the bag he carried and brutally stabbed the young girl 3 times in the stomach. As she lay motionless, he picked her up and her belongings, carrying the body through an empty lot not too far from the Grushkeva River. The man made a few mistakes when trying to hide his crime. Blood dripped from the girl's wounds onto the doorstep, and he left the light on inside the shack. The middle-aged man threw Lena's body into the river, along with her school bag, watching her as it drifted downstream. The middle-aged man turned to go home. What he didn't realize was when he put her body into the river, Lena was still alive. On the following day, Lena's body was discovered floating in the river. Svetlana Grankova went to the police and described the middle-aged man that she saw walking away with little Lena. After a police artist committed to portrait the description Svetlana gave him, the police immediately arrested a suspect named Alexander Krevenchenko, who had served 6 years of a 10-year sentence for the rape and murder of a 17-year-old girl in 1970. But at the time of his arrest, Krevenchenko wore no glasses and had never worn glasses. After Krevenchenko's arrest, and then enduring the questioning of local authorities, the sketch rendered by the police artist of the middle-aged man Svetlana saw with Lena before her alleged abduction circulated throughout the town. And when police showed the sketch to the principal of a local mining school, he stated that it resembled a man who teaches at the school that he administered at. That man's name was Andrei Chikatilo. The police thereafter warned the principal that he was not to tell anyone that he made an identification of Chikatilo. 2 detectives that discovered the shack noted they found droplets of blood on the steps of the shanty and also noticed the light left on inside that illuminated the small area of the vacant lot through the dark winter atmosphere. After inquiries to his neighbors, the authorities picked up Chikatilo after they learned that he owned the building near the river where they found the blood droplets. However, they soon released Chikatilo after his wife provided an alibi for him, saying that he had been with her the whole evening. Evidence against the middle-aged Chikatilo proved daunting, but authorities agreed that Krevenchenko made a better suspect. After obtaining a quote-unquote confession, the court sentenced him to 15 years in prison. Most citizens in the village of Shakti believed this to be too lenient for a man who had already served time for a rape and murder. A local judge decided to review the evidence against Krevenchenko and reissued a sentence of death. By the time the Soviet Union finally executed Krevenchenko in 1984 for the 1978 murder of Lena Zhanitovo, dozens more women and children fell victim to this brutal killer. Some citizens believed if law enforcement would have questioned why Chikatilo was not questioned further by the authorities, this indeed would have spared many lives from a deviant murderer. But Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo certainly exhibited traits of someone who would have stayed under the radar as a serial killer due to his lack of ambition and the events he experienced earlier in his life. Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo was born on October 6, 1936, in Lebolchne, Ukraine, a small farming village. As a member of Stalin's peasant class, Chikatilo knew very well the conditions of the time and the death and destruction through collectivization. In fact, families experiencing really hard times were said to eat sawdust bread and even domesticated animals. One time, when Chikatilo was 5 years old, his mother told him that his older brother, Stefan, had been kidnapped and was believed to have been eaten. This rendition deeply affected the young boy, and he often visualized how his older brother died. The Soviet Union drafted Chikatilo's father, Roman Chikatilo, into the Red Army during World War II, and he found himself captured as a prisoner of war. Chikatilo often ridiculed his father for allowing himself to be caught. Although Chikatilo's father was released from a German prisoner of war camp and then from a Russian camp for his classification of being an enemy of the state, Chikatilo, who had already become a die-hard communist by the age of 10 years old, by the time of his father's release, often scolded his father for having surrendered. As a child, Chikatilo became very studious and was considered a scholarly student. He had an effeminate manner, and classmates incessantly teased the young man. Also, because of Chikatilo's vision, he was very nearsighted, he feared that the teasing would continue and refused to wear his glasses, waiting nearly 20 years before getting his first pair of glasses. As he got older, Chikatilo's contemporaries ceased their teasing as he grew taller, stronger, and retained a lot of the material that he had read. At the age of 16, Chikatilo became his school's newspaper editor and political information officer, positions that allowed him to display his arrogance and power over the other students. Despite the positions of authority that he attained within his educational institution, Chikatilo still lacked social skills, especially when it came to the females around. At the age of 18, Chikatilo applied to Moscow University but failed the entrance exam and blamed his rejection from the law program on his father's war record. But also, at this time, his confidence in approaching the fairer sex became more prominent. Even though he showed some success with initial contact with women, Chikatilo often failed in the sex department because he could not maintain an erection during sexual activity. Because of this failure, Chikatilo found sexual solace in incessant masturbation. At this time, during his period of national service, Chikatilo forcefully tried to have sex with a woman who rejected all his advances. He learned that he could take whatever he wanted when overpowering his alleged conquests. Furthermore, the more she fought, the more excited Chikatilo became and eventually ejaculated into his pants. Only then did he release the woman. After completing his national service, Chikatilo moved to Russia, to a small town just north of Rostov, where he worked as a telephone engineer. After saving enough money, he moved his parents and his sister to his new home. A few years after moving his family, Chikatilo's sister introduced him to a young woman named Faina. A short courtship developed, and eventually Chikatilo and Faina were married in 1963. Subsequent to their marriage, Faina learned that Chikatilo was unable to consummate the marriage and had no real interest in sex with her. Eventually, Faina convinced her husband to have sex with her, and of this intercourse, the two welcomed a daughter, Lyudmila, in 1965, and again a boy, Yuri, born in 1969. In 1971, Chikatilo gained degrees in literature and Marxism-Leninism from a correspondence program. He then became a teacher at a local vocational school in Novoshashtinsk, Russia. Because of his shyness and inability to instill classroom management, Chikatilo's students made fun of the instructor, and his colleagues never took him seriously, referring to him as odd. Even though Chikatilo raced ridicule and teasing from both his colleagues and pupils, he later admitted that being around the children caused him great sexual arousal. This arousal later translated from voyeurism and sexual abuse of both female and male students. Chikatilo resigned and moved from teaching position to teaching position. At another school, Chikatilo found himself in charge of the boys' dormitory. In one incident, he tried to perform oral sex on a boy in the dorms, and some of the senior boys discovered what Chikatilo was trying to do and taught him a lesson not to try it again. As a result of the beating, Chikatilo took to carrying a knife with him wherever he went. Because of the Soviet system at the time, an indiscretion by a single teacher could reflect on the entire faculty, and therefore no one reported it to authorities. In 1978, Chikatilo moved his family to the town of Shakti. Not too long after the move settled, Chikatilo bought a small shack near the river where he lured little Lina Zakotnova. After repeating his offenses against students, the school where he worked relieved him of his teaching duties. Unable to find another teaching job, Chikatilo found a job as a supply clerk for the Rostov Ripper, a local complex company. His job description called for the extensive travel throughout the country to purchase supplies for his employer. This seemed like the perfect cover for Chikatilo to traverse the country looking for new victims. Larissa Tkachenko was a 17-year-old teenager who ran away from her home at a very early age. No stranger to sexual activity, Larissa entertained young soldiers and was not above exchanging sex for a meal and a place to stay. On September 3, 1981, while waiting at a bus stop outside of the Rostov Public Library, Chikatilo approached her very easily as he made her a similar offer for a meal in exchange for sex. Chikatilo then led the young girl into the woods and, refusing any restraint, began to tear at Larissa's clothing. As the young girl was used to impatient lovers, she fought the middle-aged man off as best she could. Chikatilo smashed Larissa about her head with his fists, forcing her to the ground. In order to muffle her screams, Chikatilo forced dirt into the girl's mouth as he strangled her to death. He then bit off one of her nipples and ejaculated over her corpse. After completed this perversion, Chikatilo danced with joy over the body, got rid of her clothes, and then placed branches over the body in a half-hearted attempt to conceal his deed. With the murder of his first victim, Lena Zakhanova. Chikatilo felt unsatisfied and longing to commit another murder. But with the killing of Tkachenka, Chikatilo was left with an appetite hard to satisfy. While in this frame of mind, on June 12, 1982, Chikatilo committed another murder when he traveled to the town of Zaplavskia, where he killed 13-year-old Luba Biuruk after he followed her from a bus stop. Chikatilo, when he realized the two were far from the main town, blitzed Biuruk from behind, and when he failed to physically rape the girl, he pulled a knife from his pocket and stabbed at her wildly, including gouging out her eyes. Because of the summer season, when authorities found her body, it had already decomposed to the point of almost skeletal remains. After the murder of Biuruk, Chikatilo murdered 6 more times within the year of 1982. Lyubov Voloboyeva, aged 14, on July 25th. On August 13th, Oleg Pazhidevyev, aged 9. On August 16th, Olga Kuprinya, aged 14. On September 8th, Irina Korobelnikovia, aged 19. On September 15th, Sergei Kuzmin, aged 15. And on December 11th, Olga Stelnik-Kinyuk, aged 10, had gone to a piano lesson at a nearby conservatory. A local farmer found Olga's nude body in a rusted tractor tut and left her there, and because she was murdered in the winter, the body held a high degree of preservation. The pattern of the knife wounds was clearly discernible. Olga's skull and stomach had been pierced numerous times, as it appeared the killer reached a height of killing frenzy. The victim's organs had been moved around in the body cavity, and especially attacked the victim's eyes, lungs, and sexual organs. The killer also attacked Olga's eyes, a signature that Chikatilo consistently perpetuated upon his victims. 2 of the victims were young males, which caused detectives great confusion when they finally got around to recognizing some sort of pattern in the murders. Because no detectives in the Soviet Union held any experience as to serial murder, the fact that the powers that be refused to recognize that the Soviet bloc countries ever experienced what was termed a Western problem, authorities began looking for 2 separate killers. Further confusion ensued when 2 of the victims were found outside of the Rostov area. Even with the connection between the murders outside of the jurisdiction, authorities stated that no link existed between the murders. The assailant increased the frequency of his attacks, and authorities were dealing with a vicious, sexually motivated serial killer who left little or no evidence with which police could use to catch him, except for the semen left on numerous victims. Sometime after June 18, 1983, Chikatilo murdered Laura Sarkisian. Before the summer of 1983 ended, Chikatilo murdered 3 more times. Sometime in July, he murdered Irina Dunenkova, age 13, Ludmila Kushuba, later in July, age 24, and on August 9, 1983, Igor Gudkov, aged 7. Gudkov suffered a brutal defilement compared to some of the other victims. It seemed with this last murder, Chikatilo's attacks became viler and more sinister, and his enraged passion took over his demeanor. Also with this last murder, 13 children were butchered, of which 6 were found. The Central Moscow militia, now concerned in 1983 with the disappearances and the murdered children, and therefore sent a Major Mikhail Fetisov in an investigative team from Rostov in order to take over whatever investigation had been instituted. Major Fetisov examined the investigation thus far and reported to his superiors in Moscow that the local police bungled the investigation from the very beginning and acted with impunity, that Major Fetisov severely questioned their competence. The visiting lawman strongly believed that a single sex-crazed killer committed the murders thus far. Major Fetisov's conclusions were accepted with the reservation by his superiors, but those same commanders still would not accept that a serial killer was responsible for committing the murders.
The need for a more specialized unit became readily apparent with the intervention of the Moscow militia. Major Fedosov immediately assembled a squad of experienced investigators, including an intuitive, intelligent, and observant forensic analyst, Viktor Burakov, who also held a special talent in crime scene investigation. In addition to Major Fedosov and Burakov, the major selected his deputy commander, Vladimir Kolishnikov, a seasoned investigator who also held the same belief of his boss, that a serial killer operated in the area of Shakhty and around the Rostov area. The powers that be gave the new unit its own office and retitled it Division of Especially Serious Crimes. Since most of the bodies had been discovered in wooded areas, these crimes were labeled the Forest Strip Killings. Because the Soviet Union spent more money for technology regarding defense and less on law enforcement, computers were not widely used, and information fell upon the handwritten cards for suspects and criminal files. Details of particular individuals questioned by authorities were placed upon index cards and then filed with the proper jurisdiction. One of the cards, Burakov noticed, held the name of Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo, who was questioned but then released when his blood type did not match the samples from the crime scenes. Police therefore released him. After releasing Chikatilo, police picked up a likely suspect who had been lurking around the bus and train stations. The suspect, a man named Yuri Kalenik, age 19, who exhibited the IQ of a severely mentally challenged person, confessed to stealing a car with 4 other friends and then confessed to murdering 7 children. Even though Kalenik and his 4 friends were questioned about the murders, but could not provide any details only the killer or killers would know. As the murders tended to continue, the police believed they were dealing with a gang of imbeciles and dropped that line of inquiry, releasing the men to family members. Another theory that authorities explored demonstrated that the killer must be employed as a driver, able to cover huge distances through the course of his employment. Police interviewed over 150,000 people, and then the authorities dropped this inquiry as pointless. By September of 1984, Chikatilo was responsible for the murders of 19 more people within the year. It became obvious through the unit's cursory examination that the murderer suffered from some sort of psychopathy that caused his behavior to kill. The unit examined all records from mental health hospitals, searching for any individuals prone to violence and sexual crimes. The unit also perused criminal records as well, to check for known sexual offenders or any suspect that may have been questioned about such crimes in the past. This tedious task meant that each person flagged had to be interviewed, prove their whereabouts at the time of the known timelines surrounding the murders, and blood taken to see if it matched the semen from one of the victims, Sergei Markov. The medical examiner discovered semen in Markov's anus and determined that the killer had type AB blood, and if any of the researched suspects matched that type, authorities brought them in for questioning. Those that didn't were released. Because of the brutal nature of Chikatilo's crimes, the government refused to place any news about the murders in the newspaper. They feared that Western governments may read the foreign papers and see that the authorities, at least at the command level, demonstrated a modicum of incompetence. Detective Burakov believed that if the public would have known about Chikatilo's rampage, his victim tally would not have climbed as it did. On one of the victims, investigators discovered a single gray hair, and Chikatilo started removing the upper lips of his victims. This caused mystery amongst the investigators, as there seemed to be no apparent psychopathy that could have defined his latest action, other than he started collecting souvenirs of his work. At this particular point, authorities noticed that Chikatilo's pace quickened. At first, he murdered 6 victims a year. By the end of 1984, Chikatilo murdered 1 every 2 weeks, and some of them more frequent. Burakov and the other investigators hoped that he would make a mistake, but the unfortunate aspect is that they would have to wait until some innocent soul fell under his heavy hand. Other than the minuscule amounts of evidence so far, and the limitations of forensic examination at the time in the Soviet Union, very little went to identify the killer. As a result of the surveillance of bus stations, tram stations, and train depots yielded numerous suspects for questioning. 2 men in particular piqued the unit's interest. One would later become an informant, while the other turned out to be the man for which authorities searched. The Soviet Ministry of the Interior decided that the unit needed expansion, and therefore 200 more detectives, a task force of sorts, joined the hunt for the Rostov Ripper. Burakov then saw promotion to the head of this task force and now had the manpower to more closely scrutinize the vast amounts of leads the unit received during the investigation. This also allowed for some officers, both male and female, to work undercover at some of the train, tram, and bus stations to smoke the killer out. During one of the surveillance positions in a Rostov bus station, a detective spotted an older man who spoke to a female, and when he escorted her to her bus and she got on, he then turned, went back into the station, and immediately began conversing with another adolescent girl. Investigators believed this suspicious behavior and decided to question the man. The man they stopped was none other than Andrei Chikatilo. Chikatilo stated that he lived in Shakhty, but visited Rostov many times on business as a part of his employment as a supply clerk for a local company. When asked about why he talked to young adolescent girls, Chikatilo stated he once worked as a teacher and that he missed speaking with young people. The officer then let him go. On another occasion, the officer spotted Chikatilo speaking to a woman again and decided to follow him onto another bus. There, Chikatilo seemed very uneasy and was always twisting his head from one side to the other. After the officer caught Chikatilo soliciting a prostitute, who then performed oral sex on him while on the bus, the officer arrested him for indecent behavior in public. When investigators searched his bag, they found a jar of Vaseline, a long kitchen knife, a piece of rope, and a dirty towel. None of these implements had anything to do with his employment as a supply clerk. The officer brought Chikatilo to the station, and a medical technician drew his blood, type A. Chikatilo was also a member in good standing within the Communist Party and had impeccable references. Investigators decided to hold him anyway, believing that if Chikatilo sat in a cell for a few days that his tongue would loosen. He did not admit to anything but the fact that he had a sexual weakness. Under pressure from the Central Committee, investigators released Chikatilo. Officers later arrested Chikatilo for thefts he committed at work, and he spent 3 months in prison. During that time, no murders were committed, but he did not match the blood type allegedly belonging to the killer. Since Burakov realized that he was, in fact, dealing with a serial killer, he decided to speak with a Russian murderer that could give him some insight into the assailant he pursued so relentlessly. Burakov sat down to interview Anatoly Slivko, the sadistic murderer of young boys who sat in a Russian prison serving time for his crimes. Slivko attributed his actions to inability to engage in a normal sexual relationship, including arousal and satisfaction. Burakov learned through Slivko that sexual murderers incessantly fantasize and operate within a certain set of self-imposed rules that constantly demand that their fantasies must be acted upon. Burakov learned something about appearances and posturing regarding serial killers. Slivko demonstrated that he had no remorse nor moral compass. Several hours after the interview, Russian authorities executed Slivko for his crimes. Burakov strongly believed that X was much like Slivko and had no moral compass and no respect for human life, if that human life prevents the murderer from achieving total sexual domination and satisfaction.
The body of a dead woman turned up in July 1985 in Rostov. Later identified as Natalia Poklistova, this victim's corpse had no defilements other than the repeated stabbings that demonstrated Chikatilo's handiwork. On August 18, 1985, the body of Irina Gulyayeva, aged 18, was found in another wooded area near Rostov, and she bore all the signs of a Chikatilo murder. The assailant buried her in a shallow grave, save for her hand that remained above the surface of the dirt. Burakov and the others of his squad wondered whether there existed other shallow graves where the killer may have secreted the remains of other victims. According to the knowledge of Russian authorities, there were no more bodies found throughout the rest of 1985. In 1986, after poring over the details of every case and frustrated with the elusiveness of the killer, Burakov suffered a nervous breakdown. Feeling weak and exhausted, he suffered from insomnia, and his superiors, who, surprisingly, were very compassionate with the star detective, gave him a short vacation. Although no murders occurred throughout the course of 1986 that the investigators were aware, Burakov again concentrated on the case following his release from a mental health facility. When he returned from the sojourn, Burakov approached his superiors with an idea of bringing in a psychiatrist to examine the behavior of the killer based upon the crime scene photos, the types of wounds to the victims, and any general characteristics that could be gleaned from all the evidence and documentation. Detective Burakov suggested that psychologists and sexual pathologists step forward from the Rostov Medical Institute to formulate some sort of profile so that authorities would know what to look for in this killer. Most of the specialists demurred because they claimed a lack of information from the crimes themselves in order to formulate an accurate profile. But one psychiatrist, Dr. Alexander Bukanovsky, stepped forward and offered to assist police as abnormal psychiatry was his specialty. Burakov allowed Dr. Bukanovsky to view all the crime scene reports and photographs. The alienist spent months poring over the material to portray some sort of profile on the individual who could do these things to other human beings. Dr. Bukanovsky produced a profile 65 pages in length and listed every deviation in human nature that he could examine with reference to this killer. When he finished his report, Dr. Bukanovsky, having worked with gay men, sexual dysfunction, necrophiles, and necrosadists, stated that this killer, which the doctor labeled as Killer X, was not psychotic due to the fact that he maintained control of his deeds, but exhibited traits of narcissism and arrogance, considering himself gifted, but not overly intelligent. Although not the creative type of killer, he planned each murder as he found his intended victim, and even though he murdered young boys, Dr. Bukanovsky considered the assailant to be heterosexual, and murdering and assaulting the young boys merely served as a vicarious surrogate. He needed to watch people die in order to receive the ultimate in gratification. The Ripper hit the victims in the head to incapacitate them, and the multiple stabbings were a way for him to enter them sexually. When murdering his victims, according to Dr. Bukanovsky, X sat astride them or squatted next to them, getting as close as possible. Where the cuts and slashes entered more deeply than others, the doctor stated these represented the height of his pleasure. X may masturbate after the victim has expired. Dr. Bukanovsky also sensed the interest in X removing the eyes of certain victims. In many cultures, the eyes are believed to be the windows to the soul, and that the lens records the last thing the victim sees before death. The doctor reasoned that perhaps X believed in this superstition and wanted to remain unidentified to continue his murdering. Cutting into the female sex organs allowed X to maintain control over his victim. He may keep the organs or eat them. Removing the sex organs of boys may have been a way that X tried to neutralize them to appear female. Dr. Bukanovsky stated that X may be approximately 5 foot 10 inches tall, between 45 and 50 years of age, size 10 shoe, and had a common blood type. Dr. Bukanovsky confirmed that some already thought the murderer exhibited characteristics of a sexual deviant. The alienist concluded that the killer suffered from some sort of sexual dysfunction and brutalized his victims to compensate for it. At the age with which the doctor assumed the age of X, this is the period when most sexual perversions are developed. X most likely had a difficult childhood. His fantasies were quite vivid, but in actuality, his sex life left a lot to be desired. And, if X were married, his wife certainly let him keep his own hours and did not interfere with his comings and goings. Because of the compulsion with regard to his murders, X may stop some time, but only temporarily if he sensed close to being captured. But X's killing certainly would continue either until he died or authorities captured him. Furthermore, and finally, the doctor hypothesized that X may be controlled or triggered through the barometric pressure, most specifically when the barometer may have dropped. Although there may have been other stressors at home or work, Dr. Buchanovsky believed that only one has to look at the time of the week when the murders occurred. Most of the killings occurred in midweek, Tuesday through Thursday. Even though, at the time, Burakov believed that nothing in Dr. Buchanovsky's profile contained anything practical to find the murderer, the detective called the doctor once they had a suspect in custody to apply parts of his profile to the life of the suspect. Surprisingly, to Burakov, the good doctor arrived on point regarding the killer's behavior. From the spring of 1987 until early fall, the killer went back to work. On May 16, 1987, Chikatilo murdered 13-year-old Oleg Marenkov, but the boy's body would not be found until after Chikatilo's arrest some 3 years later. On July 30th, the father of Oven Bilovetsky found his son's body in the woods adjacent to the Ukrainian city of Zaporizhia, and Chikatilo lured a 16-year-old boy named Yuri Tereshinuk from a train near Leningrad, killing the boy and then leaving his body in some nearby woods. The following year, a nude female body was found near the grounds of a metal factory near the Krasny-Sulin station on April 6th. Investigators discovered that the female had her hands bound behind her back and multiple stab wounds all over her body. The tip of her nose had been sliced off, and the killer crushed her skull. The unidentified woman had not been killed in the woods, and the only evidence the police located at the scene happened to be a large footprint. The body displayed no signs of sexual intrusion. Burakov wondered whether he should consider the most recent discovery to be included with the rest of the murders so far. Speculation arose as to whether the killer stopped all of a sudden until, on May 17, 1988, the body of a 9-year-old boy was discovered near the train station in Ilovaisk, Ukraine. The boy had been missing for 2 days, and authorities identified him fairly quickly as being Alexei Voronko. A classmate of the young boy noted to law enforcement that he witnessed Alexei walking with a middle-aged man who had gold teeth, a mustache, and a sports bag. The fact that the middle-aged man had gold teeth could narrow down the list of suspects due to the fact that no one in that area could afford gold crowns. When the medical examiner performed the autopsy on Alexei, he noted that the boy had been sodomized and his orifices filled with dirt. The young boy also had several knife wounds about his body and skull, and his penis had been removed. Near the end of the year, the Ministry of Health made an unusual statement by saying it had been a mistake to assume that typing blood in secretions was an accurate match to blood types. There were rare paradoxical cases in which they did not match. Burakov then believed that certain suspects that were eliminated because of their blood type could have, quite possibly, been the murderer. The idea that semen samples would have to be retaken to match the samples the killer already left at some of the crime scenes seemed daunting to Burakov and made it seem as though the investigation would have to start from square one. On July 14, 1988, Chikatilo murdered Evgeny Muratov while on a trip to Donashos. Police would not find the boy's body until April 10, 1989. At the time of the discovery, his remains decomposed considerably. On March 1, 1989, authorities discovered the body of 16-year-old Tatiana Raishoza, a runaway from Krasny-Sulin. Chikatilo later stated that he killed this young girl in his daughter's apartment and then dismembered her there. Officers and undercover detectives working the stations failed to notice whether any middle-aged men accompanied children or young women. A ticket clerk, however, remembered seeing a middle-aged man lurking around the train stations around the time that Tatiana disappeared. The ticket clerk remembered the man because he tried to lure her son from the platform into the woods. The police located the man, but later cleared him. On May 11, 1989, a young boy aged 8 disappeared. The authorities later identified the youth as Alexander Dyankonov. He would be found 2 months later by the side of the road where his body had been stabbed and his genitals mutilated. Alexander had just celebrated his 8th birthday. Chikatilo changed his habits somewhat from leaving the previous victims in the woods, where Alexander was found on the side of the road, in the open. Authorities hoped that the killer was now becoming more careless in his dumping methods. This placed authorities on alert that the killer may have noticed all the surveillance occurring at the train stations and, as a result, changed the way he chose his victims. On June 20th, 1989, Chikatilo murdered Alexei Moiseyev, a little boy aged 10. Chikatilo later confessed that he took him from a beach into the forest. On August 19, 1989, Chikatilo lured a young woman off of a bus and murdered her near the village of Rostov. Helena Varga, aged 19, had a child of her own and wound up being Chikatilo's 44th victim to date. On August 28, 1989, Alexei Kobatov, aged 10, encountered a middle-aged man outside of a theater in Shakhty. This was the last time anyone saw the young boy again. When Chikatilo finished with the boy's body, he buried it in a nearby cemetery. No more murders were reported until the following year, when news arrived that an 11-year-old boy, Andrei Kravchenko, was abducted off the streets of Shakhty on January 14, 1990, and his dismembered and emasculated body was found on February 19, 1990. On March 7, 1990, the body of Yaroslav Makarov, aged 10, was found the following day after he was reported missing from a local train station after being truant to school. The medical examiner noted that Taroslav was missing his tongue and his sexual organs. On April 4, 1990, Lyubov Zayeva, aged 31, was lured off a train heading from Novocherkassk to Shakhty at the Donishlo station. It seemed that Chikatilo may have sensed that his apprehension was near because he quickened the pace of his killings. On July 28, 1990, Chikatilo lured a 13-year-old boy named Viktor Petrov from the train station at Rostov Glavny, where he stayed with his family. Authorities found the boy's body at the Botanical Gardens, badly mutilated and just a few yards away from where Yaroslav Markov had been found on March 8th. Because of the new perestroika, or restructuring of the Soviet system, the press clamored to find the killer and pressure was brought to bear on the authorities to do so. The commanders in Moscow put a great deal of pressure on their underlings to find the killer or they would be fired from their positions. People all over the nation acted desperately to find the murderer. As desperate as they had become to find this murderer of young people, it still did not deter Chikatilo from continuing his bloody rampage. On August 28, 1990, the murderer showed boldness when he abducted an 11-year-old Ivan Fomin from a public beach when the young boy went into the bushes to change. Chikatilo struck, stabbing the boy 42 times and then castrating him. Drawing on the manner in which Chikatilo seemed to be selecting his victims, Burakov chose a different course of action. He would select the most likely stations and then make surveillance very obvious in the others. Burakov wanted to project the image that the surveillance areas with plainclothes police officers would appear safe to the killer. What Burakov saw was to force the killer to act in a particular place, and in those places, officers stationed there would record the names of those men who acted suspicious and were questioned. Furthermore, Burakov placed men dressed as farmers adjacent to the woods and fields that surrounded train stations. It seemed an extravagant undertaking, but it had to be done if the killer was going to be captured anytime soon. Because the Donlisko station saw two of the victims lured from there, Burakov believed it to be a great place to start. But even before Burakov could enact his most recent plan, Chikatilo abducted someone else from that exact station. On October 16, 1990, Vadim Gromov, age 16, met Chikatilo in the train station as he headed to Taganrog. The murderer easily lured the young man into the woods, where he stabbed him repeatedly, over 27 times. Chikatilo then removed the victim's tongue, his testicles, and one eye. Vadim was an ideal victim for Chikatilo, as the boy was mentally challenged, and for entertainment, the teenager often rode the Elektrika, the electric slow-moving train. No one saw him exit with anyone. Burakov believed that if the plan to capture the killer had been allowed implementation sometime earlier, the killer could have been caught long before. This drove Burakov to despair, and many observing the dogged detective believed he would suffer another nervous breakdown before the murderer could be caught. Especially during the depths of this second round of depression and the plan in place, Chikatilo struck again. On October 30th, 1990, 16-year-old Viktor Tishenko, a rather athletic and strong youth, went to the Shakhty station to pick up some train tickets for his family. There, he met Chikatilo, who enticed the young man into the woods. When Chikatilo tried to subdue the young man, he fought hard, biting the attacker's finger and breaking it before the assailant managed to gain the upper hand in the fight and stab Tishenko enough to weaken the boy and get him on the ground. Authorities later discovered Tishenko's battered and mutilated body 2 miles south of the station in the woods. 2 previous victims, Svetlana and Tatiana Petrosian, were found in almost the exact spot 6 years before. Burakov hoped this would be the last murder as he set the trap where all the killer had to do was walk into it. But again, Chikatilo avoided any detection whatsoever when on November 6, 1990, he found a homeless woman named Svetlana Korostik, aged 22, whom he brought into the woods where he beat, sliced her open, and cut off part of her tongue. No witnesses saw her with anyone who would have matched the killer's description. In continuing the investigations around the stations, one name stood out as to someone who was questioned before, but because of the semen blood anomaly and the fact that he was a Communist Party member, he had to be released. Burakov knew the lab work was anything but competent, but when he heard this name again as having been at the train station the same time that Korostik had disappeared, his gut told him that Andrei Chikatilo was their killer all along. Chikatilo was spotted at the train station where Korostik had disappeared, and several witnesses stated they saw him walking out of the woods and washing his hands at a pump. At the time the witnesses observed this, they also noticed that he had a red smear on his cheek and twigs clung to the back of his coat. One of the undercover officers spotted Chikatilo and made inquiries which he promptly recorded. When Burakov learned of Chikatilo and the incident at the train station, he placed the middle-aged man under strict surveillance. Burakov subsequently learned that all of Chikatilo's business trips coincided with the murders that took place within the time period in which the investigations took place, including the one in Moscow. He saw himself fired from other positions as a supply clerk as he failed to return from these trips with the supplies. Additionally, during the time of his incarceration in 1984, no murders occurred. Burakov believed this to be no coincidence. He also learned that the former teacher lost his position due to his proclivity to abuse children. As a consequence of his incarceration, Chikatilo lost his good standing with the Communist Party and summarily was kicked out of the organization. Although the evidence on Chikatilo proved circumstantial, Burakov and his superiors realized they needed him to confess. When officers reported back regarding the surveillance, they saw an ordinary man doing nothing unusual. Finally, on November 20th, 1990, 3 officers dressed in street clothes brought Chikatilo in for interrogation. They noted that he was married, had 2 children, was an intellectual of sorts, and his mouth contained an overabundance of gold teeth, as one witness stated to authorities. Famous government attorney Isa Kostyev handled the initial phases of the interrogation. Although Kostyev had been characterized as a mean interrogator, he decided that in order to get a murderer like Chikatilo to confess, he would have to maintain an even tone without anger and utilize compassion. The experienced interrogator wanted the room to show no signs of abundance and ordered that the interrogation room be stripped of everything except a table, 2 chairs, and a safe that would hint at the evidence that the authorities had against Chikatilo. Kostyev noticed when Chikatilo first entered the room the day subsequent to his arrest that he walked with a shuffling gait, much like an elderly person. He also noticed that the suspect murderer was tall, with a long neck, sloping shoulders, and oversized glasses. To Kostyev, he knew the shuffling was a ruse and viewed Chikatilo as a calculating killer with plenty of strength and energy he called upon to commit his crimes. Kostyev viewed the suspect as easy to break, as he strove to get inside Chikatilo's head, figure out his logic, and then extract a confession. Killers love to brag about their exploits once they have been apprehended, and Kostyev believed the subject now sitting before him was no exception. Kostyev knew he only had 10 days to get the confession from Chikatilo, or, under Russian law, they would have to release the suspect. Kostyev started right away by telling Chikatilo that the authorities had made a mistake, just like they had in 1984 when they first investigated Chikatilo. The suspect denied having been at the train station on November 6th and did not know why witnesses reported his presence there at the time. Kostyev knew Chikatilo lied and let him know that. For the first day, the interrogation ended. On the following day, November 22, 1990, Chikatilo waived his right to counsel and then wrote a 3-page statement that he spoke about his sexual perversion and his sexual weakness. What Kostyev hoped would be a full confession turned out to be a pleading to lesser crimes other than murder. Chikatilo admitted in a longer essay that he observed the children at the train stations and took interest in how the homeless beggars always preyed on these children. He also admitted to his sexual impotency, and the essay appeared to be an indirect confession where Chikatilo pointed to other suspects other than himself and how he often thought about suicide. However, he never admitted to murdering anyone, especially children. After perusing the confession, Kostyev stated to Chikatilo that his only hope was to confess fully to all the murders and that a court would appoint a psychiatrist to attest to his insanity where he could be treated instead of incarcerated. Later attestations brought Chikatilo to admit to fondling female students and admissions that he lost all self-control when it came to being around children. In subsequent essays written within the 10 days, Chikatilo revealed no details about the murders. However, after a medical examination took place, the lab technicians discovered that Chikatilo's blood type was A, but his semen allegedly had a very weak B antigen, thus making it appear that his blood type registered as AB, though it wasn't. This was the paradoxical case that technicians mentioned earlier in the investigation. Other hematologists and DNA experts scoffed at the assertion even years after the case was solved. After a few days of interrogation, Burakov and others became nervous due to the fact that there were not that many days left with which to charge Chikatilo with the murders on the evidence they possessed, and still there was no confession. Burakov heard from an informant in Chikatilo's cell that the interrogation techniques were not working because the suspect became very defensive when asked about the murders, almost as if he wanted to guard his methods so that other killers would not experience the satisfaction that he had in committing them. Kostyev went so far as to bring in photographers to take pictures of Chikatilo in trying to make the suspect believe there were witnesses that were going to testify against him once these witnesses identified Chikatilo from the photographs. Still, the suspect refused to confess fully. Kostyev steadily approached the 10th day with virtually nothing to show. Burakov suggested bringing in another interrogator, someone who may know the criminal mind more than the police. Burakov suggested bringing in Dr. Bukanovsky, who wrote the original profile on the person he named Killer X. Kostyev reluctantly agreed. On the 10th day of questioning, Dr. Bukanovsky entered the interrogation room, sat down, and introduced himself to Chikatilo. The doctor only agreed to this type of interrogation out of professional curiosity and not for anything to do at trial. However, once Dr. Bukanovsky sat down and began reading the report he wrote based upon the evidence collected at the time, along with his viewing of the crime scene photos, the doctor understood that he described in his initial assessment the type of man who could commit these murders in such a brutal fashion. It became readily obvious through the many hours of Dr. Bukanovsky's reading of his report to Chikatilo that the accused murderer listened intently to every word of the report as the doctor read it and became visibly shaken with the assessment. When Dr. Bukanovsky walked out of the interrogation room after almost 13 hours, he turned to the investigators and said that the suspect was ready to confess. Kostyev then prepared a statement that Chikatilo then signed, admitting to 36 murders. At the time, law enforcement did not know the exact number of victims that Chikatilo had murdered. Chikatilo admitted that he wanted to tell about his life and what eventually led him to the crimes he committed. When he could not perform sexually on the victim, he used his knife as a substitute. Chikatilo then answered the question about the blindfolding and the taking of the eyes. He did not want the last image that authorities could see in the victim's eyes to have been his face. He also stated that he just did not like the victims looking at him. Chikatilo also told of his cannibalism when he accosted then murdered a young beggar girl in the woods, using his teeth to bite off her nipple and then swallowing it. Chikatilo went into the details of all the 36 murders that Kostyev charged the suspect in committing. Sometimes he acted as a predator, and other times the victims were mere victims of opportunity. Chikatilo remarked that the stabbings were often substitutes for sexual intercourse. He answered why, with the male victims, that he would cut off their tongues or their penises, although he did admit that he took revenge against life itself when removing the genitals of his victims. In the end, Chikatilo confessed to more than 56 murders, although the authorities could only corroborate 53. Burakov actually believed there could have been more. Now, the authorities had enough evidence to try Chikatilo for the murders. In order to secure the defendant and make sure that no vigilantes would hurt him or end his life before the trial, or the state had a chance to carry out any sentence, the court constructed a steel cage with which Chikatilo was consigned to sit in during the entire trial, which began on April 14, 1992, with 225 volumes of evidence against and about Andrei Chikatilo. Family members of the murder victims packed the courtroom and screamed at the defendant, who simply just ignored them. Oftentimes, during the proceedings, Chikatilo acted as though he was unaware of his surroundings in an attempt to bring forth a plea of insanity. But several psychiatrists deemed him sane enough to face justice. Also, Chikatilo knew what the sentence the court intended to impose and yelled at the judge several times. After witnesses called to the stand testified, evidence presented, including the defendant's confession, the judge took 2 months to reach a verdict, and on October 14, 1992, the judge found Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo guilty of child molestation, 4 counts, and 52 counts of murder. After hearing the verdict, Chikatilo screamed at the court and began a conniption fit within the cage where he demanded to see the corpses. The judge sentenced Chikatilo to execution for his crimes. Guards escorted the now convicted serial killer back to his cell to await the results of a summary appeal. On February 14, 1994, the day when his appeal was denied, guards led Chikatilo to a soundproof room within the prison and shot him behind the right ear, executed as deemed his sentence by the court.
The aftermath of the Andrei Chikatilo trial drew greater attention to serial killers and made this one more infamous than ever within the world culture. Because of Dr. Bukhanovsky's assessment of the serial killer, Russian authorities were better prepared in dealing with what once was thought to be a Western problem. In 1999, Newsweek published a story that since the execution of Andrei Chikatilo, serial killers seemed to run amok in the area of Rostov, Russia, where it had been renamed the serial killer capital of the world. With killers such as Onoprenko, whom we've profiled here on True Crime Man's Dark Imagination, and others such as Popkov, it would appear that Rostov is a hotspot for the serial killer mentality. As far as being the serial killer capital of the world, we still may need to look toward the United States to hold that title. Dr. Bukhanovsky later opened a clinic where he claimed to have a cure for violent psychopaths. Some of the criminals that the doctor got to confess to their crimes stated that he had a way of making people tell their most closely guarded secrets. As for the man who once held the title of the most famous detective on the planet, Viktor Bukharov, after capturing Chikatilo, his superiors promoted him to the rank of colonel, and his methods are still studied today. Sadly, he died in 2018. Until next time.